Chapter 1. There was a little light in the darkness. On a starless and moonless night, there wasn't the slightest bit of light in the misty valley. Apart from the faintly discernible light in the center of the distant valley, most of the place was covered in boundless darkness. The night was somewhat cold, and the bleak sound of the wind was accompanied by a slight chill. When the wind blew through the valley, a strange dark color surged like a tide. It was a mist unique to this valley. The valley was very large. During the day, one could see the undulating mountains surrounding it, but during the night, one could only vaguely see the tall shadows, like a silent giant standing on this piece of land. The gap between two mountains on the northwest side of the valley was the only way in and out of the misty valley. Outside the valley, on the same rugged and dangerous mountain path, a figure was walking over. There was a sudden murderous intent in the darkness. Someone in front of the mountain path shouted a few words in a low voice. The figure that was walking over stopped for a moment. With the dim light in the night, one could see that the person was a young man dressed in black. The young man's expression was calm, as if he was not surprised by the sudden appearance of this obstruction. After listening to the whisper in the darkness, he also used a low voice to reply. One question and one answer like a password, but also like a secret code. Soon after, the murderous intent hidden in the darkness slowly receded, and the black-clothed youth continued to walk forward. However, this part of the mountain path to the entrance of the misty valley seemed quiet and cold, but on this night, it seemed to be particularly strict. On the way, just the same kind of questioning had appeared 3 times. The black-clothed youth answered fluently, calmly passing each of the questioning. In the darkness of the night and the cold night wind, he gradually approached the entrance of the valley. At the side of the mountain path at the entrance, there was a raised hill. Several rocks of different sizes were scattered on the hill, and one could vaguely see a white figure standing at the top of the hill. The black-clothed youth's body paused for a moment. After standing in the same place for a moment, he turned around and walked up the hill. There was no path on the small hill. Weeds grew and swayed slightly in the night wind. When he was about to reach the top of the small hill, the black-robed young man saw a wooden sign stuck in the ground in front of him. From the bottom to the top, there was a strange pattern engraved on it. Above, there were gods flying in the sky, and below, there were ghosts howling. In the middle, there was an incomparably huge tree that stood between the sky and the earth, connecting gods and ghosts. It looked like a picture of a giant tree with gods and ghosts attached to the tree. The black-clothed young man glanced at the wooden sign. After pausing on the picture on it for a moment, he looked at the figure in white standing 10 feet behind the wooden sign. In such a dark night, a person dressed in white was naturally very conspicuous. At this time, as if hearing the footsteps, the person in white turned around and saw that it was an extremely handsome man. When he saw the man in black, the corners of his mouth curled into a smile. "You're here, Hei Lang." The black-clothed youth called Hei Lang nodded and walked over. At the same time, he said, "Yun Jian, if your father saw you dressed like this, I'm afraid he would scold you again." Yun Jian's expression was relaxed and calm. He smiled. "It's okay. Tonight's important matter is imminent. The old man has a lot of things to do in the desolate valley. Why would he care about me?" Hei Lang smiled and walked over to stand side by side with Yun Jian. Looking into the distance, he saw that in the night, other than the dense fog in the valley behind him, there were countless mountain ranges in the distance. Although it was impossible to see the true appearance of the mountains during the day, one could still imagine the majesty and grandeur of the mountains. Yun Jian suddenly let out a long breath and said, "Hei Lang, how long have you been in the divine sect?" 6 years. "So long." Yun Jian's face showed a trace of emotion. He then smiled and said, "I still remember that when you first came, you were still a teenager, about the same age as Xiaoqing. Now, in the blink of an eye, you've both grown up." Hei Lang smiled and did not say anything. Yun Jian continued, "Oh right, Xiaoqing also came tonight. She might be here soon. Do you want to wait for her?" Hei Lang shook his head and said, "The elder ordered me to send the last blood-soul crystal into the valley for the god's subduing incantation. I'm afraid that the divine incantation will be activated soon, and I won't be able to come out. I'll see you later. Yun Jian raised his eyebrows and revealed a strange expression. He looked at Hei Lang and sighed after a moment. Only someone like you has the ability to obtain such a rare object like the Blood Soul Crystal. No wonder my father has valued you so much all these years. He's even more intimate than me, his own son. Hei Lang raised his head to look at Yun Jian and frowned. He seemed to want to say something, but Yun Jian immediately laughed and said, All right, it's just a joke. What kind of relationship do we have? How can I doubt you? As he spoke, he seemed to have suddenly thought of something. A trace of ridicule appeared on his face as he said to Hei Lang, Oh right, when the matter is over, quickly come back to me. Xiaoqing might have a secret to tell you. Hei Lang was startled and said, Secret? What secret? Yun Jian smiled and said, If I say it, would it still be a secret? Just remember to come back and see me later. Hei Lang thought for a moment and nodded slightly. All right. As he spoke, he nodded to Yun Jian, turned around, and strode away. Not long after, he walked down the hill and into the valley, disappearing into the boundless darkness. After Hei Lang walked for about the time it took to brew a cup of tea, there was suddenly movement on the mountain path below. After a while, a light sound was heard and a light body flew up from below. She turned around in midair and landed beside Yun Jian. It was a beautiful woman that was as beautiful as a flower. When Yun Jian saw her, there was a trace of joy on his face. However, when he saw the woman beside him, he frowned and snorted. Nonsense! Aren't you afraid of accidentally stumbling? It'll be too late to regret it then. The beautiful girl giggled and seemed to be very close to Yun Jian. She grabbed his arm and said with a smile, Big brother, you're here. What's there to be afraid of? Yun Jian shook his head and smiled bitterly. How can I have such a heartless sister like you? All right, Hei Lang just left here and went into the valley. The sister he mentioned, who was also the beautiful woman named Yun Xiaoqing, let out an ah and looked towards the valley. She then complained to Yun Jian, Really? Big brother, why didn't you stop him? You clearly know that I have something to say to him. Yun Jian shook his head and said, The important matter is more important. He has the Blood Soul Crystal and needs to be sent into the Great Kala Array in the valley. When the God-subduing incantation is activated, he still needs to help Father and the other elders. He really can't stay here for too long. Chapter 2. Yun Xiaoqing pursed her lips and suddenly looked perturbed. She sighed softly and muttered, If he knew about this, what would he think? Would he not like it? As she spoke, she bit her lips lightly and unconsciously placed one hand on her lower abdomen. Yun Jian smiled and said, Silly girl, don't worry. Black Wolf will definitely be very happy. Yun Xiaoqing looked a little worried. She looked at Yun Jian and said, Big brother, how did you know? Yun Jian laughed and shook his head to comfort her. You are childhood sweethearts and grew up together. Others may not understand this relationship, but do you not believe him? Moreover, we cultivators steal the creation of heaven and earth to obtain supreme power. The price is that it is difficult to have children. The higher the cultivation realm, the more it is so. Now that you are pregnant with his child, this is a joyous occasion. Would Black Wolf be angry? Yun Xiaoqing's eyes flickered. There seemed to be a layer of ripples in her crystal-clear eyes. They were bright and had a hint of depth. After a while, she finally nodded heavily. A smile appeared on her face again. She nodded and said, Big brother, you are right. Yun Jian smiled and touched Yun Xiaoqing's head dotingly. He said, Anyway, I am waiting for my nephew to be born. Oh yes, I forgot to tell you. Father also knows about this. Yun Xiaoqing was shocked. Her face turned red and she was embarrassed and annoyed. She said angrily, Big brother, why did you say such things? Father is going to scold me to death. Yun Jian sneered and said, Why would Father scold you? Let me tell you frankly. Father is very happy about this. Yun Xiaoqing's eyes widened and she said in disbelief, Really? Yun Jian said, Of course. Otherwise, Why do you think Black Wolf could enter the forbidden land of the desolate valley and even participate in the god-subduing mantra? Even if he has the secret technique to condense the blood soul crystal, it is still possible to not let him participate at the most crucial moment. Yun Shaoqing said softly. You mean, Father wants to... Yun Jian continued with a smile. Naturally, after knowing that he's about to have a grandson, he finally sees Hei Lang as a family. The Tao techniques that the two of us cultivate are in conflict with the god-subduing mantra, so we can't get close to the valley. But Hei Lang has the bloodline of the burning blood crystal, so he's close to the god-subduing mantra. If we don't vigorously support our future son-in-law, who else can we support? Yun Shaoqing's face revealed a look of relief and joy. She nodded repeatedly and looked at the dark valley. She put her hands together in front of her chest and prayed softly. May everything go smoothly and everyone return safely. After saying that, she glanced around from the corner of her eyes. Suddenly, she saw something and let out an ah, as if she was pleasantly surprised. Yun Jian looked from the side and saw Yun Shaoqing walk to the side and pluck something from the wild grass on the ground. Yun Jian took a closer look and saw that it was a red flower. Yun Shaoqing beamed and said to Yun Jian, Big brother, look, the acacia flower has bloomed. Yun Jian shrugged his shoulders. The acacia flower was just a common wildflower that could be found everywhere in the mountains. It had no spiritual tattoos, nor was it a spiritual material or a medicinal herb. It was useless to cultivators, so he said grumpily, It's just a wildflower. Why are you making such a fuss? Yun Shaoqing didn't care about him and only smiled as she held the red acacia flower in her palm and looked at it. Then, she said with a smile, This flower has bloomed so beautifully. It must be a good omen. The night wind blew, and the bright red petals of the acacia flower trembled slightly in her snow-white palm, as if they were whispering softly. Hei Lang walked into the misty valley. At first, the path was a rugged path between two towering peaks, but as he went deeper, the path gradually widened. What was strange was that he didn't light any lamps along the way, and his surroundings were dark, but he didn't make any mistakes, as if he was already very familiar with the terrain here. After walking through the small path into the valley, although it was still dark ahead, Hei Lang seemed to have adapted to the darkness, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to have become even more flat. This was the middle of the valley. Because of a strange reason, this valley looked ordinary, but in reality, there were no spiritual herbs that could grow in this valley. There were mostly ordinary weeds and trees, as well as common wildflowers like the acacia flower. Because of this, to the cultivators in the world, this valley was desolate, and this was where the name Desolate Valley came from. Hei Lang looked forward and saw that in the center of the valley in front of him, there was a ball of fire burning. This scene reflected in this valley that was completely shrouded in darkness, and the dot of fire was especially conspicuous. He took a deep breath. At this moment, when there was no one around, he looked a little nervous and kept staring at that spot. After a while, he gently spat out a turbid breath, and his face quickly returned to calmness. Then he strode towards the light of the fire. Under the night sky, the depths of the valley seemed to be filled with a strange aura. It was invisible and colorless, but seemed to be everywhere, which made people's heart beat faster. It seemed to be an emotion of admiration and fear for the unknown and terrible power. The flames came from a bonfire burning in the valley. What was lit was not firewood, but some strange things. Bones, furs, stones, oddly shaped medicinal herbs, and the strangest thing was large chunks of flesh and blood. They burned silently just like that. If one walked closer, he would find that the strange fuel would flash with strange spirit patterns from time to time, flashing and emitting invisible but strong waves. A large wooden sign, about 10 meters high, was inserted outside the bonfire. As Hei Lang had seen before, it was painted with a giant tree pattern of immortals and ghosts. Next to the bonfire sat 3 old men. One of them had a plain face that looked like an immortal, and the outline of his face was vaguely similar to Yun Jian. He was sitting on the main seat of honor. The old man on his left was bald and fat, but he had a pair of white eyebrows that hung down his cheeks. The old man on his right was thin, dark, and haggard, with only skin left on his face. He looked somewhat terrifying. Hei Lang walked to the bonfire and bowed to the three old men, saying, "Greetings, elders." The three people turned to look at him at the same time. The dignified elder and the fat elder both nodded, but the skinny and haggard elder's face darkened. He suddenly sneered and said, "Yin Shouyang, what right does your subordinate have to be in the divine formation?" Chapter 3. The old man in the middle frowned and revealed a trace of displeasure on his face. He said indifferently, "Just based on the 3 blood soul crystals he obtained, is that enough?" The skinny elder's expression was cold, and he did not seem to fear Elder Yin Shouyang at all. He was about to speak when he heard the fat elder next to him try to smooth things over. All right. This little guy can obtain blood soul crystals. Not only is it beneficial for casting the incantation, but his cultivation method must also be compatible with the god subduing incantation. Everyone is free to do whatever they want, and it's not like we're taking anything from you. Skinny guy, don't talk so much. The skinny elder snorted coldly and closed his eyes. Yin Shouyang smiled at the fat elder, and the fat elder nodded in response. Yin Shouyang then waved at Hei Lang. Hei Lang walked over and knelt down a little behind Yin Shouyang. He then took out a completely black dagger and placed it on the ground. 3 inches in front of the dagger's blade, there was a small crystal that was bright red and had the texture of an amber agate. It was attached to the dagger. Yin Shouyang's gaze swept over the small red crystal, and then he looked at Hei Lang. His eyes were gentle as he nodded at him. Hei Lang lowered his head and did not speak. He quietly knelt behind him and waited. However, when his gaze swept over the ground in front of him, he suddenly noticed that in a small patch of wild grass not far away, a small red flower was blooming beautifully. He glanced at the flower and then looked away. This dark night seemed to be exceptionally long. Even time seemed to slow down at this moment. Endless darkness clustered around this valley. After an unknown amount of time, the 4 people by the bonfire suddenly raised their heads at the same time. In the deep darkness in the distance, from an unknown place, a heart-palpitating drumbeat suddenly sounded. The bonfire in front of them, which was still burning, suddenly trembled violently. It became chaotic, and countless sparks flew. If flames had a life of their own, then at this moment, this ball of fire seemed to be roaring angrily, but also seemed to be afraid and panicking, constantly trembling and swaying there. The sound of heavy footsteps suddenly came from the valley. The next sound came from an extremely far distance. In just a few steps, he had already crossed a long distance and arrived near the flame. The faint drumming never disappeared, and it seemed to be getting more and more urgent, making one's heart beat faster uncontrollably. A moment later, a tall figure slowly walked out from the darkness. The flames suddenly dimmed for a moment. It was because all the flames had suddenly lowered their heads, as if they were expressing their respect to this person. Then, the figure casually waved his hand. Suddenly, the flames grew brighter and soared into the sky. In an instant, they grew several times stronger and illuminated the surrounding area of more than 10 zhang. Hei Lang raised his head, and his gaze landed on the figure that was slowly approaching. The person who had come was a very old man, but he was not a human cultivator that was commonly seen in the divine central plains. He looked to be at least half the height of an ordinary person. Moreover, he seemed to be hunched over and looked somewhat tired. The old man held a thick wooden staff in his hand. It was incomparably heavy, and its surface was carved with bright red flame patterns. 2 sharp fangs protruded from his mouth. Perhaps because he had lived through so many years, the fangs had turned from snow white to a dull gray. And this person's face was tattooed with countless dark blue totem patterns, most of which were related to fire. He looked especially terrifying. Hei Lang's pupils contracted slightly, and a word suddenly flashed through his mind: barbarian. The barbarians were a strange race that lived in the southern border continent of the divine Central Plains. They were separated from the human race by the incomparably huge land of chaos. In the past, Although the human cultivators did not have a blood feud with the barbarians, they had never lived in harmony with each other. Just like this barbarian who looked very old at this moment. When he walked past the wooden sign, his eyes swept over the huge tree pattern on the wooden sign, and a trace of obvious contempt suddenly flashed across his eyes. At the same time, 7 unusually tall and majestic figures appeared behind the old barbarian. Without exception, they were all muscular barbarian warriors. Each of them was like a small mountain, and their bulging muscles seemed to contain endless power. Even if it was just a hand-to-hand fight, ordinary demonic beasts would probably not be a match for them. However, these 7 incredibly powerful barbarian warriors seemed to be unusually respectful towards the old barbarian in front of them. When they saw the old man wave his hand casually, they stopped in the darkness and did not come any closer. Heilang's gaze fell on the old barbarian again. He thought to himself, legend has it that the barbarian tribes have always had a position of shaman, a supreme leader. Perhaps this old man in front of me is one? At this moment, the gazes of the 3 elders also fell on the old barbarian's face. After a while, Yin Shouyang nodded at him and said, I've long heard the great name of the fire shaman. Now that I've seen it for myself, the venerable one indeed has supreme power and is especially sensitive to fire spiritual energy. I admire you. I admire you. The barbarian old man let out a low laugh. His voice was abnormally deep and hoarse, like the sound of a broken bellow, and it made one's hair stand on end. He said, in the eyes of you human cultivators, we are all uncivilized barbarians. What's there to admire? Yin Shouyang smiled faintly and said, since we've entered the 3 realms divine sect, we've always seen all living beings in the 3 realms as equals. We don't have the leisure to differentiate between these meaningless things. The old barbarian laughed softly and did not say anything. Yin Shouyang asked again, have you brought the thing? The old barbarian put his hand into his bosom, and after searching for a while, he took out a necklace. There were many white bone ornaments hanging on the necklace, and in the middle of the largest bone, there was a small hole dug out. Inside the hole was a small object that was shining with a strange luster. The 2 ends of the object were pointed, and the middle was bulging. It looked like the grain of wood, and it was dark green in color. It looked like the seed of some unknown tree. Looking at it from afar, it did not seem to be anything special, but it made people feel that this seed was full of vitality. As soon as this item appeared, the 3 elders of the 3 realms divine sect were shocked. They stood up together and stared at the white bone, especially at the seed, not letting go. After a while, the 3 of them looked at each other and nodded slightly. It seemed that they had confirmed it. The rotund elder seemed to be the most excited. He clenched his fists and said with an eager and excited expression, since everything is ready, let's begin. Chapter 4. With that said, the fat elder was the first to impatiently return to his original seat. Yin Shouyang and the skinny elder looked at each other and sat down as well. The bonfire burned brightly, illuminating the surroundings and revealing the deep wrinkles, scars, and strange totems and tattoos on the old barbarian's face. He looked like an old beast, and there seemed to be a trace of vigilance hidden in the depths of his eyes. His gaze swept over the 3 elders, and then he slowly walked to the fire and sat down on the last seat. In between, he even panted a few times. His heavy breathing sounded like the whine of some kind of wild beast, as if his old body was already somewhat unable to bear the burden. Yin Shouyang patiently waited for the fire shaman to sit down, then said in a low voice, let's begin, wait. Suddenly, a deep and coarse voice interrupted Yin Shouyang's words. The 3 elders of the divine sect of the 3 realms looked at the fire shaman at the same time, only to see the old barbarian slowly raise a finger and point to Yin Shouyang's side. This person, let him go. The fat and skinny elders frowned at the same time. Yin Shouyang snorted and said, Heilang is my confidant, and he has cultivated a secret technique that can condense blood-soul crystals. Venerable One, you should know what that thing is for the God subjugation mantra, right? The fire in front of him was reflected in the old eyes of the fire shaman, but they seemed unusually bright in the vicissitudes of life, as if two balls of fire were burning from within his body. He said slowly, "I don't trust him." Yin Shouyang raised his eyebrows, and a trace of anger flashed across his eyes. He then said coldly, "According to the ancient records of the divine sect, when casting the God subjugation mantra, if you have the help of the Blood Soul Crystal secret technique, the chances of success will increase by at least 10%. I wonder if the Venerable One has any objections to this?" 10%. The fat and skinny elder's expressions changed at the same time. It was clear that this seemingly insignificant 10% was extremely significant to them. However, they didn't know what this God-vanquishing curse was. It was so difficult for people of their statuses. After hearing Yin Shouyang's explanation, both of their faces lit up with joy. The rotund elder could not help but grumble to Yin Shouyang in a low voice. "Why didn't you tell me and the skinny one about such benefits?" Yin Shouyang nodded slightly at him, then looked at the fire shaman sitting on the other side of the fire. His eyes were bright, and just as he was about to say something, he suddenly heard the old barbarian's hoarse and low voice ring out again. This time, he repeated, "I don't believe him." Even the fat and thin elders couldn't bear to watch any longer. They were figures of extremely high status in the Central Divine Prefecture, and their eyes grew cold. Yin Shouyang frowned. "Then what do you want? Let him go." The fire shaman's hoarse voice reverberated in the empty valley like a dying beast king. He was old, but still had the majesty of old. "If you insist on keeping him here, you must plant my black flame curse on him. He must swear that he will not harm the God-vanquishing curse, or else he will be devoured by the black flames. His flesh and blood will be burned dry, and his soul will be destroyed. He will never be able to enter the cycle of reincarnation, and will suffer the pain of being burned by the flames forever. Only then can I be at ease." Yin Shouyang flew into a rage. He suddenly stood up and glared at the fire shaman. "How dare you plant such a demonic technique on my disciple?" The fire shaman sneered, the corners of his eyes drooping slightly. He did not seem to care about Yin Shouyang's anger at all. His old eyes seemed to have seen too many vicissitudes in this world, and now only the raging flames were left. However, at this moment, another voice suddenly came from Yin Shouyang's side. It was the skinny elder. He said calmly, "The Venerable One's words do not seem to be wrong." Yin Shouyang turned his head abruptly and stared at the skinny elder with a hint of surprise and anger. However, the skinny elder did not show any fear and only looked at him calmly. On the other side, the fire shaman let out a strange, hoarse laugh. It was as piercing as a ghost's as he looked over. Yin Shouyang took a deep breath and turned to look at the fat elder. Just as he was about to speak, the fat elder coughed lightly and looked at him. "Brother Yin, I also think that the Venerable One's words are not without reason, just in case. Perhaps because he had a good relationship with Yin Shouyang." He pondered for a moment and said a few more words to smooth things over. "Moreover, we all know that although the black flame curse is sinister and vicious, it is still a kind of curse. As long as the little fellow does not violate the oath, the curse will not be triggered, and there will be no problem." Yin Shouyang clearly did not expect the fat elder to say such a thing, and his expression changed for a moment. With his status and experience, he naturally knew a thing or two about the black flame curse. Although the fat elder's words were generally correct, this kind of mysterious curse that originated from the barbarian tribes deep in the southern border continent was not that simple. Just as he was thinking about letting Hei Lang leave this place, he suddenly heard Hei Lang's voice from behind. "Master, disciple is willing." As soon as he said this, there was a moment of silence around the fire. Everyone looked at the black-robed young man, including the fire shaman. The fire shaman's wise and experienced gaze also fell on Black Wolf's face. Yin Shouyang frowned and said, "The risks involved." Black Wolf knelt on the ground, his body as straight as a javelin, and said expressionlessly, "Everything is for Master's sake. This disciple will face some risks, but they are not worth mentioning." Yin Shouyang stared deeply at his young face. After a moment of silence, he suddenly took a deep breath and said, "Good. You are indeed my good disciple. I did not misjudge you." Black Wolf lowered his head and did not speak. Yin Shouyang returned to his seat and said in a low voice, "You may go." Hei Lang agreed and walked around the bonfire to the front of the fire shaman. Then, just like before, he quietly knelt beside the old barbarian. The fire shaman's aged gaze swept across the young man. Even though he was an old man of his age and status, he couldn't help but reveal a tinge of admiration in his eyes. But it was clear that this bit of admiration wouldn't affect his will and decision in the slightest. Under the watchful eyes of the other three elders of the divine sect of the Three Realms, a short but strange ceremony quickly unfolded. The fire shaman first put his hand directly into the burning bonfire, paused for a moment, and when he retracted it, there was a burning flame in the middle of his palm. His flesh did not seem to have any reaction under the burning flame. Then, everyone heard him recite an ancient and mysterious incantation in a low voice. Chapter 5. The voice seemed to have come from the ancient times. It echoed in the distant past, passing through time and returning to this world. It brought with it a strange and mysterious power. After a while, blood flowed out of the old barbarian's eyes. Black blood. He used his hand to bring the ball of flame closer to his face. That strange face looked like a demon or a ghost, incomparably ferocious and terrifying. The ball of flame then began to twist wildly, as if it had obtained some kind of power. The two streaks of black blood quickly dried up, and the black blood floated up and merged with the ball of flame. The ball of flame turned black. It was a ball of black flame. Everything quietened down. The fire shaman chanted an ancient incantation, and under his guidance, Hei Lang faced the ball of black flame and swore an oath. He swore that he would not harm the god-vanquishing incantation tonight, and swore that he would do his best for it. If he broke this promise, he would suffer the pain of the black flame's backlash. As Hei Lang spoke, the ball of black flame swayed and slowly approached his face. Finally, from the center of his forehead, it silently and strangely merged with his flesh and blood, disappearing without a trace. When everything was over, the fire shaman waved his hand. Hei Lang stood up silently and walked back to the other side of the fire. Yin Shouyang nodded at his disciple and patted him on the shoulder. When he placed his hand on Hei Lang's shoulder, Hei Lang could feel that this powerful old man's demeanor was different from usual, as well as the slight strength he used. He raised his head to look at Yin Shouyang and nodded slightly. Then, he returned to his usual silence. At that moment, Yin Shouyang's eyes were filled with love. He thought to himself that he had not misjudged Hei Lang. After handing Little Qing over to him in the future, he would have nothing to worry about. The cold atmosphere seemed to suddenly ease up after the strange incantation. Even the fire shaman, who had always been cold, seemed to have a hint of a smile on his face. Soon, the few of them began their final negotiations. The crucial god-subduing incantation was about to begin. Hei Lang quietly knelt on the ground. The words of those people who finally felt at ease reverberated in his ears. His eyes suddenly looked at the acacia flower, and then, in more places on the ground further away, in this valley, among the weeds that could be seen everywhere, there were already bright red flowers blooming everywhere. Facing the night wind, the red acacia flower slightly trembled, like a beautiful and enchanting woman singing in the dark night. The night was still deep and silent. This long night seemed to continue endlessly in the darkness, until that speck of light suddenly burst out from the deepest part of the darkness. The dazzling radiance was like the sun that suddenly rose in the night sky. It shone brightly and turned into a huge fireball that burned fiercely. Immediately after, all the flames condensed into an incomparably majestic pillar of fire that soared into the sky, shooting into the incomparably thick dark clouds. Suddenly, the wind blew fiercely, the dark clouds rolled, the heaven and earth trembled, and a terrifying aura slowly spread from the horizon. In the desolate valley, was the source of the huge fireball. At the moment, beside the original bonfire, the three elders of the Three Realms divine sect and the fire shaman were in 4 different directions, their hands reaching into the burning flame in the middle. At this moment, below them and the surrounding ground of more than 100 feet, there were suddenly countless strange patterned flames, forming a huge and mysterious formation. All the living creatures were forced to retreat out of this powerful formation by an invisible force, including the 7 powerful barbarian guards brought by the fire shaman. The only one left in the center of this formation, besides the 4 powerful figures, was Hei Lang. At this moment, the flame had completely turned pure white. One could imagine how high the temperature had reached. And in the deepest part of the flame, there was a white bone necklace floating. Under the burning of the incomparably powerful flames, the necklace cracked inch by inch. All of the bones were burned to ashes. Only the largest piece of bone belonged to an unknown exotic beast, and it was still able to hold on. However, cracks could still be seen on it, and it seemed like it wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. And in the center of the white bone, the strange seed seemed to not be affected by the flame at all. It still emitted a vigorous vitality in the dark green luster, and seemed to be more vigorous than before. It seemed to be slowly absorbing the power of this flame. At the same time, when a large amount of flame passed through this seed and shot into the night sky, it seemed to be contaminated with that unique aura, faintly summoning something to the endless sky. An ancient incantation suddenly sounded, and the 4 extremely powerful people looked up at the sky. Almost at the same time, a terrifying aura from the sky descended upon this valley. Hei Lang sensed something and looked up. He was shocked to see that in the dark clouds in the sky, a huge dark crack had slowly opened up. Then from that incomparably deep, bottomless abyss of darkness, there seemed to be a strange gaze looking over. That crack slowly closed. The ground of the entire deserted valley suddenly began to tremble, and a rumbling sound came from the depths of the ground. At the same time, the surrounding formations on the ground all shone brightly at the same time, flashing with all their might, emitting a powerful force to suppress this piece of land. But under the pressure of the power in the sky, this large formation seemed to be quickly reaching its limit. Suddenly, in the dazzling light all around, Yin Shouyang shouted, "Release!" Without hesitation, Hei Lang immediately reached out and picked up the black dagger in front of him. With a shake of his arm, a strange blood-red light flashed across his body, and the small blood-like object flew out of the dagger and directly into the flames, landing precisely on the green seed. Boom! With a loud bang, the blood soul crystal instantly turned into nothingness, and the flames suddenly became 30% brighter. The surrounding temperature suddenly rose violently, and even the ground began to crack. But perhaps because of this powerful attraction, the dark crack in the sky also rapidly closed, and the door of darkness became bigger and bigger and was about to completely open. An ancient aura spread out from this door of darkness, and an incomparably tall figure that seemed to dominate everything began to faintly appear from behind the door of darkness and approach this world. And at this moment, the indistinct gaze was focused on that strange seed, as if only that seed full of vitality was the most attractive thing in this world. Chapter 6. Woo! It was a strange sound like an ancient call. It was as if an ancient song from ancient times was echoing in the dark. A beam of light that did not seem to exist in this world shot out from the door of darkness like a sharp sword. It flowed down the pillar of fire on the ground, then split into 4 and landed directly on the heads of the 4 people who were casting the spell. An indescribably powerful force came crashing down from the sky and poured into the bodies of the 4 people. Their bodies began to change rapidly, and their clothes began to tear, as if they could not withstand the incomparably powerful spiritual power. But the faces of the 4 people were filled with ecstasy. They gritted their teeth and endured the pain, but at the same time, they could feel the wild spiritual power in their bodies surging toward a power that was unimaginable in the past. It felt as if they had reached the heavens in a single step, or as if they were between God and man. In the next moment, they might become God. In the firelight, the door of darkness in the sky was about to descend, and the ancient figure was about to appear like a god. Everything had reached the final juncture, but it seemed that there was only one last step, that one last distance, but the door still did not open. It was as if there was only that last bit of power left. Yin Shouyang roared, "Black Wolf!" But the corner of his eyes suddenly froze. In that split second, he suddenly saw that there was no one beside him. The man in black who had been guarding him silently and determinedly had suddenly disappeared. Yin Shouyang was shocked, but before he could react, he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. A black sword had pierced through his heart and came out from his chest. A pale hand grabbed Yin Shouyang's shoulder from behind. The black-robed young man stuck close to him, his face expressionless. Then his other hand gripped the incomparably sharp black sword, and he suddenly pulled it out from Yin Shouyang's back. Yin Shouyang shouted. His body was about to react, but he was shocked to find that he could not move at all. The powerful force that descended from the sky was pouring into his spirit meridian and qi si, giving him supreme spiritual power. But at the same time, it also caused all the meridians in his body to expand, and he temporarily lost control of his body. Other than Yin Shouyang, the other three were in the same situation. At this moment, the three of them were looking at Hei Lang, who had suddenly turned violent and started killing people. However, none of them could react at this moment. At the very center of this shocking formation that was filled with unparalleled power, the weakest black-robed young man was impressively controlling everything at this moment. Hei Lang gripped the hilt of his sword tightly and pulled it out of Yin Shouyang's chest. Along with it, an unimaginable amount of blood spurted out like a rapid stream, instantly covering half of his body. It was the blood that was forced out by the power of the gods that fell from the sky and poured into his body. Once there was an outlet, it seemed to be about to be released under the great pressure. Hei Lang's face was also splattered with beads of blood, but he did not move at all. He looked at everything in front of him coldly. Then, without a word, he stabbed the black sword in his hand into the flesh on Yin Shouyang's back. One stab, another stab, and another stab. He ruthlessly and resolutely stabbed Yin Shouyang's chest into a bloody hole. After the 13th stab, the once invincible Yin Shouyang finally lost his last chance of survival in despair. He died with his head hanging down with his eyes wide open. Then, as if sensing something, Hei Lang raised his head to look at the door of darkness that had begun to tremble in the sky and let out a deafening roar. He casually threw away Yin Shouyang's lifeless body. The divine light beam that had been pouring into Yin Shouyang's body suddenly exploded, turning into countless beautiful fragments that fell into the darkness of the night. The originally stable and balanced pillars of fire and the door of darkness all trembled and shook violently. More and more pillars of light lost their light, while the divine light beams that had poured into the bodies of the other three people became brighter and their aura stronger. Crazy roars came from the door of darkness, and below, everything seemed to be getting crazier and crazier. Under the despairing gazes of the three people, the unbalanced formation collapsed piece by piece. More and more divine power flowed down like an uncontrollable torrent. In a strong wind, their bodies slowly expanded like inflated balloons. Then, tongues of fire swept up and burned every corner of their bodies. Finally, there were suddenly 3 deafening explosions. Boom! 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 The 3 bodies suddenly exploded, turning into a rain of blood and shattered bones. They were engulfed by the darkness of the night and the crazy flames. Almost at the same time that the fire shaman's body exploded, as if triggered by an invisible force, the 7 powerful barbarian warriors that he had brought with him suddenly collapsed at the same time. They fell heavily onto the burning ground, as if the thread of life that had been entrusted to them had suddenly snapped, taking away their lives. The door of darkness in the sky also suddenly closed after a final roar and a deafening roar. Then, it disappeared into the darkness of the sky. On the ground, The flames spread in all directions, illuminating the entire barren valley within a radius of 1,000 feet. In the depths of the flames, Hei Lang rushed into the depths of the flames and grabbed the white bone with the strange seed embedded in it. Where the tentacles touched, the piece of white bone instantly shattered and turned into dust. Only the dark green seed remained. Unexpectedly, it was not damaged in the slightest and fell into Black Wolf's hand. But at this moment, Hei Lang's body suddenly trembled, and he let out an incomparably miserable howl. Ah! The mournful howl spread far away, like the desperate howl of a wild beast. Black flames suddenly rose from his body and began to burn crazily. Strangely, this black flame incessantly burned his flesh, but it didn't damage Hei Lang's clothes in the slightest. Hei Lang felt like he was in purgatory. He kept howling at the sky. His flesh and blood were burning in the black flames. His skin was torn and his flesh was lacerated. Blood flowed out and quickly dried up. Indistinctly, a dazzling shadow appeared in the sea of qi on his abdomen. However, the terrifying black flames even burned this shadow. It broke into pieces and quickly disappeared into the shadows. Everything about Hei Lang, even his soul, seemed to be boiling, cracking, and shattering in the black flames. Chapter 7. For some unknown reason, Black Wolf did not collapse amidst the terrifying and cruel black flames. He roared and howled, but he still stood upright. Then he walked out of the valley step by step. His flesh and blood looked like they were burning and melting. The black flames burned into his soul, causing his mind to turn blank and confused. However, this man who was trapped in hell still walked out step by step. Outside the valley, there were already sounds of fighting and shouting. It seemed like an intense battle was happening. Not long after, just as he was about to reach the entrance of the valley, a figure suddenly flashed across the mountain path in front of him. It was a beautiful woman. It was Yun Shaoqing. She saw Black Wolf at a glance and instantly turned pale with fright. She pounced over and cried out in horror, Black Wolf, what happened to you?" Black Wolf's eyes had almost completely lost their luster. It was as if he had been completely burned by the terrifying pain. Perhaps he was just numb, or perhaps he had long developed an instinct. He leaned towards Yun Shaoqing. Yun Shaoqing shouted in panic. She opened her arms and wanted to hug him, but suddenly Black Wolf raised his right hand. The black sword that was still in his hand stabbed into her chest. Yun Shaoqing's voice came to an abrupt halt. Her beautiful face revealed a look of disbelief. She looked in horror at the man who was being burned by the black flames. Her mouth opened twice, but no sound came out. Then she collapsed on her back. Her beautiful eyes widened, as if she could not believe what she saw. Blood splattered from her chest, staining a red acacia flower on the ground beside her. In just a short while, a white shadow appeared. It was Yin Jian, who rushed in from outside the valley. He shouted loudly, "There are strong enemies attacking. There are many of them, and they are very strong. Father, what happened? Black Wolf, what happened to you?" Black Wolf leaned over. At this moment, Yin Jian had already clearly seen the terrifying scene of him being burned by the black flames. He could not believe his eyes for a moment and was dumbfounded. Suddenly, he also saw a black sword appear in front of him. In the terrifying flames, the sword stabbed into his chest. The two of them hugged each other tightly and stuck to each other. Blood spurted out, and Yun Jin's body stiffened. There was still an expression of disbelief on his face. Although the terrifying black flame was still burning, it did not burn Yun Jin's body at all. It seemed to only burn on Black Wolf's flesh forever. Hot blood once again dyed Black Wolf's body red, causing him to become completely covered in blood. Coupled with the terrifying black flames, at this moment, Black Wolf was like an evil spirit that had walked out from hell. Yun Jin clutched his chest and collapsed weakly. Before he died, he suddenly saw Yun Shaoqing lying on the ground not far away. At that moment, he seemed to have been provoked by something. He looked at Hei Lang in disbelief and roared, You actually killed her." Before he finished speaking, the black sword suddenly flew over from the darkness. With a swoosh, it cruelly and mercilessly pierced through his throat, suppressing the rest of Yun Jin's words. Yun Jin slowly lowered his head and seemed to shake his head with some difficulty. Then he died. The black sword flew back, carrying a mournful blood color. Hei Lang faced the dark sky and once again let out a mournful and tragic howl. That pain seemed to have burned all of his consciousness. But for some reason, he still did not stop. Just like that, he turned into the figure of an evil spirit and staggered in this dark valley. Gradually, he disappeared into the darkness. In the remaining footprints, each step was stained with blood. Each step was bright red. In this dark night, under the wild flames, in the end, only the dark red acacia flowers were left, like blood, trembling in the wind. The black flames burned crazily, burning everything. The entire world was in darkness. There seemed to be only crazy howls and the tragic sight of flesh and blood being burned dry. Ah! With a low roar, Lu Chun suddenly woke up from his sleep. He suddenly sat up and gasped for breath. Sweat seeped out of his forehead. The thin quilt covering his body slipped down, revealing his strong upper body that was not covered at all. He did not care and only breathed heavily. He stared blankly at the strange bed in front of him. There was a glimmer of light outside the window. It was already early in the morning. At this time, beside him, a white and plump arm stretched out from the side and gently wiped the sweat off his forehead. Then a soft voice said, "What's wrong? Did you have a nightmare again?" Lu Chun turned his head and saw that under the same thin quilt, there was a beautiful woman lying next to him. At this moment, after a night of sleep, she seemed to be a little tired, with a trace of laziness. Her beautiful hair was like clouds, draping over her white and smooth shoulders. The thin quilt was across her chest, revealing an alluring and plump skin. Lu Chun shook his head and said, "It's nothing." The woman's jade-like fingers lightly touched Lu Chun's face, caressing the side of his temples and the skin under his chin before finally resting on his shoulder. The strong and bulging muscles and her delicate fingers seemed to form a sharp contrast. Her voice at this moment, in this early morning, was like a lost dream that had not yet woken up. It carried a bit of fleeting and unusual gentleness as she said, "You just love to show off. It's still early, why don't you?" Lu Chun suddenly turned his head and smiled at her. "Ding dang, I only have one spirit stone left on me today." The woman's fingers suddenly stopped, and then she raised her eyes to look at Lu Chun. Lu Chun was still laughing. His smile was warm and sincere. Suddenly, the thin quilt on Ding Dong's body moved, and under the quilt, she heavily kicked Lu Chun, revealing a bit of snow-white skin. Her eyebrows wrinkled, and she hatefully said, "Smelly man, you talk so much nonsense, why aren't you scramming?" Lu Chun laughed out loud and jumped off the bed. He then found his clothes from a messy clothes on the ground and quickly put them on. He then casually threw a pile of undergarments and skirts to Ding Dang, who was still lazing on the bed, and said with a smile, "Wake up, wake up. I say, don't be so lazy. I see that today's weather is not bad. With such a good morning light, why not go out for a walk?" Hey, early in the morning, this lady had nothing better to do, so I went out for a stroll. At this time, the people outside are probably those idiots who work hard for a month and can't even get a few spirit stones. Ding Dang pulled over the thin quilt and covered herself tightly, only revealing a pretty face, and then spat unhappily. Chapter 8. Hearing Ding Dong's complaint, Lu Chun did not get angry, but instead smiled and said, "Hey, I'm about to go out. How can I leave now that you've said that?" He paused for a moment, then walked to the side of the bed and sat down. Out of nowhere, he took out a shiny spirit stone and threw it beside Ding Dong's pillow. Ding Dong's eyes immediately lit up, and with a cheer, she reached out to grab it, revealing a white jade arm. Lu Chun laughed and took the opportunity to stretch his hand under the blanket to grab it. Ding Dang cried out in alarm. one hand holding the spirit stone into a fist and punched towards Lu Chun, the other hand pulling the blanket tightly to block that vulgar hand. Just that her hands and feet were in a mess, and her warm and soft body was still taken advantage of by him, forcefully touching it a few times. Lu Chun immediately jumped away, leaving the warm bed, and walked with large strides to the door, opening it and walking out. The woman's coquettish scolding came from the room behind him. "Damn, stinky men really are not good people. You better remember this." The fresh morning breeze blew down from the Team Mountain in the distance. It swept over the clear, gurgling water of the clear stream, causing waves of ripples. It then brushed past the verdant bamboos and beautiful peach blossoms on both sides of the river. Thus, there was a hint of fragrance. It blew over the moss-covered wind and rain bridge, over the pond dam on the stream, over the bluestone road along the river, and finally, over the people walking in the morning light. Lu Chun stretched his waist, opening his mouth to let out a yawn, his face revealing a satisfied smile. His gaze looked around. This quiet village in the morning was the place he was currently living. This place was called King Shutang Village, named after the clear brook that snaked through the middle of the village. King Shutang Brook, the water was extremely clear and the flow was gentle. Other than the deep pond at the bottom of the Tea Mountain, the deepest part of the brook was no more than a knee deep. Usually, many children in the village would play in the water. There were many pebbles in the brook, big and small, of all shapes and sizes, and there were often some nameless gray little fish swimming in the cracks, leisurely playing. There were many green bamboo and peach trees on both sides of the stream. In this bright and beautiful season of spring, it was the time of the year when the scenery was the best. The green bamboo leaves and the pink peach blossoms complemented each other and were reflected in the clear water. It was like a beautiful painting of a mountain village, too beautiful to behold. Lu Chun strolled along, listening to the crisp chirps of birds and the crowing of roosters in the distance. Numerous farmhouses appeared on both sides of the stream. It was a little messy, without any order, but it still had a bit of the leisurely atmosphere of the countryside. At this time, there were already people walking around King Shutang Village. Lu Chun bumped into quite a few people on the road by King Shutang Creek. They greeted him with a smile and a nod. It seemed like they were very familiar with most of the people here. After walking for a while, a large locust tree appeared between the bluestone road and the brook, its branches luxuriant and leafy. Under the tree, on a large rock, sat a fisherman in a straw raincoat, fishing in the brook with a fishing rod in his hand. Lu Chun walked over and looked at the fish cage on the ground beside him, and indeed, it was empty. He couldn't help but laugh. "Old you, how many times have I told you? The fish in this brook are too small, they won't grow big, and you can't catch them. If you want to fish, go to the Little Pearl River 5 miles away from the village, or climb up the Tea Mountain and go to the Dragon Lake in the west. That's where you can catch big fish." The fisherman turned his head to look at him, a white-haired old man, then slowly said, "There are big fish in this brook. I've seen them before." Lu Chun laughed, casually picking up a rock by his feet and throwing it into the brook. With a splash, the water splashed and immediately rippled. He then said to the old fisherman with a smile, "I've lived here for so many years, but other than the gray stripes in the cracks of the rocks, I've never seen big fish in the water." "You're talking nonsense, aren't you?" The old fisherman didn't get angry, only shaking his head, then repeated, "Little Lu, I'm not lying to you. There really are fish in the water." Lu Chun laughed, as if talking to this fisherman called Old Yu made him very happy. He patted Old Yu's shoulder lightly, then turned and strode away. Only Old Yu was left sitting alone under the big locust tree. After staring blankly for a while, he cast his fishing line again, making an arc in the air before landing in the water, and continued to fish in silence. Walking along the road for another 100 or so feet, he saw a few houses built together. A few green bamboos grew in the corners of the walls, and the last house had a crooked flag hanging diagonally outside. On the flag was the character Joe, which was almost unrecognizable to others. Lu Chun walked over and casually pushed the door. The door opened, and then a somewhat helpless voice came from inside, saying, "Hey, have you seen anyone's tavern open so early?" Lucien walked into the nameless tavern unconcernedly. As expected, he saw that most of the chairs were still upside down on the table, as if they had been closed last night. He didn't stand on ceremony, walking to the window and taking a stool on the ground to sit down. Then he turned back and smiled, saying, "I'm not here to drink." At the side of the tavern's wall, behind the counter, a chubby middle-aged man with a blissful face slowly sat up. He looked at Lu Chun and asked with interest, "Oh, then I'm curious. If you're not here to drink, then why are you in my tavern?" Lu Chun patted his belly and said, "I've been tired all night, and my stomach is about to flatten. Cook a bowl of noodles to eat." The amiable middle-aged man snorted and said, "I only sell wine, not noodles." Lu Chun laughed and said, "I'm not planning on buying from you. If I don't buy, then I'll have noodles. Go." After the time it took to drink a cup of tea, a bowl of hot and fragrant onion and egg noodles was placed in front of Lu Chun. Lu Chun exclaimed in admiration. He picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. As he ate, he said in a muffled voice, "Old Ma, your cooking skills have improved again. This noodles is really good. To be honest, if it weren't for your wine and cooking, I don't know how I could survive here for the past 10 years. Old Ma took a rag from behind the counter and then walked out. He took down the stools from the table and began to wipe them. At the same time, he smiled and said to Lu Chun, "Don't talk nonsense. Even if my wine and food are so bad that even dogs won't touch them, you can still eat them without batting an eyelid." Lu Chun ate the noodles in big mouthfuls, as if he didn't hear what Old Ma said. Old Ma didn't care. He put down the stools in the tavern and cleaned them. When he turned back, there was only an empty bowl on the table in front of Lu Chun. Chapter 9. Lu Chun let out a burp and rubbed his belly in satisfaction. He smiled and said, "The taste isn't bad. It's a good meal." Old Ma glanced at him and put away the bowl. At the same time, he lightly said, "You want to see Ding Dang again last night?" Lu Chun leaned against the wall and casually crossed his legs. He looked at Old Ma and smiled. "What, you're interested in her too?" Old Ma snorted and said, "She's just a prostitute. I'm not interested." Lu Chun rolled his eyes and said, "Prostitutes aren't people. She also wants to live a good life. What's more, she can't just let anyone in her house and bed her. At least in this village, she has to like the person." He smiled and looked at Old Ma and said, "Look at your fat body. Ding Dang definitely won't like you." Old Ma cupped his hands and said, many thanks. Please don't like me." Lu Chun couldn't help but laugh and scold him with a smile. "You bastard, why are you making things difficult for a woman?" As the two were talking, the outside of the house gradually became lively. As time passed, the warm sun finally rose over the peak of T Mountain and shone down on the village at the foot of the mountain. The village seemed to have woken up and was filled with all kinds of sounds. Lu Chun sat in the wine shop and listened for a while. He suddenly said, "These 2 days, the villagers have been busier than usual. Is it almost time for the Thousand Autumns Gate to send people down to collect grain and tea?" Old Ma thought about it and said, "It's about time. Today is the 6th of the 3rd month. In 4 days, which is the 10th of the 3rd month, the Thousand Autumns Gate will send people down." Lu Chun looked happy and said, "They're finally here. If they didn't come, I would have spent all my spirit stones." Old Ma sneered, a look of disdain on his face. In today's world, the immortal path was flourishing in the central divine continent. There were countless cultivation sects, and the immortal cultivation clans and aristocratic families of various sizes had occupied countless paradises, spiritual mountains, and scenic sceneries. They recruited disciples widely and diligently sought the immortal path. King Shitang village was originally just an ordinary little village. However, 100 years ago, Nansong Mountain, which was about 15 kilometers away from here, was occupied by someone. From then on, they established a sect and called themselves the Thousand-Year Sect. Since then, they had become the most powerful cultivation sect in the area. Because of this, King Shutang Village, which was only 30 miles away from South Pine Mountain, was naturally included in the Thousand Autumn sect's sphere of influence. At the same time, because it was located on the main road to South Pine Mountain, there were quite a lot of people coming and going. As a result, the village gradually became more prosperous. To the people of the mortal world, Chi refinement cultivators were the equivalent of Immortals. Within 1,000 miles, the strongest sect, the Thousand-Year House, was naturally the local tyrant. At the same time, in addition to cultivating their own Tao, cultivators often needed more natural and spiritual materials to support them. King Shitang Village was a place with beautiful mountains, clear waters, fertile soil, and abundant spiritual energy. Thus, the Thousand-Year sect had developed it into an important production area. The fields in front of the village were planted with spirit grains, and the tea mountain behind the village was filled with spirit tea. At the beginning of every month, people would come to collect the spirit grains and spirit tea. At the same time, they would also distribute spirit stones to those who turned into spirit grains and spirit tea. Lu Chun leaned against the window of the small tavern, watching the gradually bustling scene of the village and the hopeful faces of the people outside. He suddenly turned around and said to the owner of the tavern who had come out with a jug of wine, "Old Ma, why do you think these people work so hard to grow those things and then do everything they can to live frugally? Just what do you think they're doing?" Old Ma replied indifferently, "Isn't that obvious? Out there, which one of those people doesn't want to become immortals and become immortals? Don't they work so hard to accumulate spirit stones so that they can go to the Thousand-Year sect and see if they have the talent to become immortals?" Lu Chun pursed his lips. The Thousand-Year sect is a little unkind. It's just a common test, but they insist on collecting 1,000 spirit stones from each person. How many people have they driven to their deaths? I've seen many people in this village collect 1,000 spirit stones at the age of 50 or 60. Then they go to the Thousand-Year sect and spend all their life savings to see through the mirror. Most of them don't have any talent. The rest might have a bit of talent and could barely cultivate, but they were kicked out because they were too old. Then some cried like crazy, and their lives were pretty much ruined. Old Ma shrugged and said, "Although this method is not very presentable, it's still passable. At least it's not too ugly. There's no forced enslavement or anything like that. It's already good enough." Lu Chun couldn't help but laugh. He stood up and said with a smile, "It's rare that you would speak up for a sect that doesn't make the cut." Old Ma said indifferently, "Last year, the Thousand-Year sect was ranked as a beginner middle-rank sect on the list of 10,000 immortals issued by Zheng Xiaming. It's no longer a small sect that doesn't make the cut." "What the hell?" Lu Chun was shocked. His eyes widened as he looked at Old Ma. "No way, I don't think this trashy sect is qualified." Old Ma poured himself a cup of wine and said with a smile, "They sent 50,000 spirit stones to true Lord Guangbo and Zheng Xianming. Of course they're qualified." "Oh." This time, Lu Chun was even more surprised. He looked up and down at the chubby tavern owner in front of him and said with a smile, "My goodness, haven't you been staying with me in this village all these years? How can you be so well informed?" Old Ma smiled, but didn't say anything. He just raised his cup to him and drank it in one gulp, with a mysterious smile on his face. Lu Chun looked askance at him and scolded, "You're so sneaky. How many things are you hiding from me?" Old Ma immediately shook his head and said, "Nothing. It's not like you don't know what's going on here." Before he finished speaking, they suddenly heard a loud noise coming from outside. It was so loud that it broke the silence of the village, as if something big had happened. Lu Chun and Old Ma frowned at the same time and looked outside. After a while, Lu Chun said, "It seems to be coming from the entrance of the village." Old Ma said, "You stay here. I'll go and have a look." Lu Chun shook his head and said, "Let's go together." Old Ma wanted to persuade him again, but when he saw Lu Chun's expression, he hesitated and didn't say anything. They walked out of the tavern and walked all the way to the front of the village. On the way, they saw many villagers running in the same direction. Many of them looked surprised and excited, as if they had heard some special news. Chapter 10. Old Ma took 2 steps forward and suddenly saw a familiar villager who frequented the tavern. He quickly grabbed him and asked, "What's going on up ahead? Why is it so noisy?" The villager did not stop and said loudly, "I heard that a few immortal masters from the Thousand Autumns sect found a demon from the divine sect of the Three Realms who had snuck into the sect. He's now at the entrance of the village." Old Ma's body shook, and he unconsciously let go of the villager. After a while, he turned around and looked at Lu Chun, who was beside him. He saw that his friend was frowning slightly, his face indifferent, but there seemed to be a strange light in his eyes. Old Ma took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "Let's go back." Lu Chun looked at him and said lightly, "If you turn back now, wouldn't it look even more strange to others?" Old Ma frowned and looked around. Sure enough, almost everyone in the village was walking in the direction of the village entrance. At this time, if only the two of them suddenly turn around halfway, it would indeed be a little conspicuous. At this moment, Lu Chun reached out and patted his shoulder, saying, Let's go take a look together." As he said that, he walked straight ahead. Behind him, Old Ma sighed helplessly and followed. The two of them walked all the way to the entrance of King Shitang village. The place was half filled with water and half filled with fields. There was only a path in the middle that led outside. About 300 feet away from the entrance of the village, there were 5 people dressed in similar clothes standing there. One of them had a foot-long wound on his chest. Blood seeped out and dyed half of his body red, but he still held a sharp sword in his hand, as if he had not given up on struggling. The other 4 spread out and surrounded him, also holding sharp swords in their hands. They all looked disdainful and disgusted. Lu Chun and Old Ma stood in an inconspicuous spot in the crowd and watched the scene unfold in front of them. They saw that the 5 people were dressed in the style that the disciples of the Thousand Autumns sect usually wore. The 4 who surrounded them consisted of middle-aged men and young men, while the injured one looked to be in his early 20s. He seemed to be the remnant of the divine sect of the Three Realms that was being hunted down and hunted down. From the corner of his eye, Old Ma looked to his side and saw that everyone was looking at them eagerly and nervously. No one had noticed the 2 of them, so he nudged Lu Chun without saying a word, but his eyes showed a hint of inquiry. Lu Chun stared at the young man for a moment and did not speak. He only shook his head lightly. For some reason, Old Ma suddenly breathed a sigh of relief. At this time, the leader of the 4 from the Thousand Autumns sect, a middle-aged man with a cold expression, pointed his sword at the young man and shouted, "Vile spawn! You're about to die, and you still don't know how to repent?" The young man was heavily injured, and his expression changed. He smiled bitterly and said, "Master, I've always been respectful to you and served you well. I've never done anything wrong to you. Why do you still treat me like this?" The middle-aged man heard this and frowned. A hint of hesitation flashed across his face. It seemed that the person in front of him had always been his favorite, but now he was a little hesitant. The young man suddenly fell to his knees and threw away the sword in his hand. He crawled forward and cried to the middle-aged man, Master, I was wrong. Please forgive me." The middle-aged man sighed, and the sword in his hand slowly drooped. He sighed and said, "The sect's rules are strict, and the League of Immortals has strict orders. There's nothing I can do. You can only blame yourself for walking the wrong path." Fine. Since we're master and disciple, I will." While he was speaking, the people around him were also listening attentively. However, in a distant corner of the crowd, Lu Chun suddenly snorted softly. Old Ma, who was beside him, was slightly startled and turned to look at him. At this moment, someone suddenly shouted, "Martial uncle, be careful." The middle-aged cultivator's body trembled. Before he could react, the young man who was kneeling in front of him suddenly pulled out a short blade from under his sleeve. The young man's figure burst forward, and he directly stabbed the middle-aged man's abdomen with the short blade. This sneak attack was vicious. Even though the middle-aged man's cultivation was far stronger than the young man's, he was caught off guard and couldn't dodge. However, the middle-aged man's cultivation was extraordinary. With a roar, all the muscles in his body tightened. At the same time, he struck out with his palm and sent the disobedient disciple flying. He staggered back 3 steps and was about to roar when his voice suddenly became hoarse. He looked down and saw that the wound on his abdomen was bleeding black blood. "There's poison on the blade." The other 3 disciples of the Thousand Autumns sect had already rushed forward with angry roars, surrounding the young man and attacking him. The young man was seriously injured. He had already thrown away his long sword, and he did not retrieve his dagger after injuring the middle-aged man. At this moment, he was empty-handed. Under the siege of his 3 former fellow disciples, he could only retreat in defeat. However, there was no fear on his face. Instead, he seemed to have gone mad. He laughed and shouted at the top of his lungs, "The true God has descended and unified the 3 realms. In the future, I will ascend to the ranks of Immortals and go." Before he could even finish his sentence, he had already been struck by a ray of sword light and fell to the ground. The disciples of the Thousand Autumns clan, who followed closely behind him, all looked like they hated this person to the core. They all followed closely behind. Sword lights rained down, and in the blink of an eye, blood splattered everywhere. In an instant, this person was reduced to a pile of meat paste in broad daylight. Immediately afterward, the 3 of them quickly turned around and surrounded the injured middle-aged cultivator. When they saw the wound, they looked at each other with fear on their faces. At this time, the middle-aged man was the calmest. He whispered in a hoarse voice, "Let's go back to the mountain." Only then did the 3 of them react, and they hurriedly agreed. Then, one of them carried the middle-aged cultivator while the other 2 protected him, and they dashed away. No one cared about the remnant of the divine sect of the 3 realms anymore. Only a short period of time had passed since they received the news and rushed out to witness the sudden change in the fierce battle. However, the intrigue and fierceness of the battle had greatly shocked the mortals who were watching the battle. After a while, the people at the entrance of the village slowly dispersed. At the same time, among the discussions, most of them were curious about the divine sect of the 3 realms. Many people knew about this. Since it wasn't a secret, they took the opportunity to tell the young people who didn't know much about the divine sect of the 3 realms. The general idea was that the divine sect of the 3 realms was actually a sect with a long history. They believed in the 3 realms of gods, humans, and ghosts. Chapter 11. It was said that there were many fanatics in the 3 realms divine sect who firmly believed that only by opening the world wall and inviting the true God to descend to the mortal world and unify the 3 realms would the world be united. Because of this, they did all kinds of strange things and killed a lot of people. They were even given the title of demon sect and were not tolerated by the world. Many years ago, this sect was labeled as the #1 evil sect by Xiangxiaming and ordered the world to hunt them down. Since then, they have not seen the light of day and turned to secret activities. But these years, it was said that there were many disciples who infiltrated the many cultivation sects in Xiangxiaming and secretly did some sinister things. It was really a big problem for the world's righteous path. The crowd dispersed while discussing. No one cared about the corpse of the remaining member of the 3 realms divine sect. After a while, someone would naturally come to clean it up. Old Ma and Lu Chan were at the back of the crowd and slowly walked into the village. Old Ma said in a low voice, "How is it?" Lu Chan was expressionless, and even his tone did not change as he said, "A bunch of lunatics." Walking back to the village, the clear stream, green bamboo and peach blossoms, as well as the distant green mountains, the tranquil and beautiful scenery seemed to isolate the bloody scene from before. It made people subconsciously feel that the chaos and turmoil was still a long way away. After walking for a while on the Bluestone Road, Lu Chan suddenly saw a peach tree in front of a fork in the road. The branches were full of tender red, and under the tree stood a beautiful young woman, leaning on the tree. Human face, peach blossom. For a moment he did not know which was more beautiful, but it was Ding Dang. A wind blew and a few petals fell. She stood there in a light dress, as if she was a fairy, as beautiful as a fairy who was not tainted by the mortal world. Many of the villagers who passed by saw this scene, and many of the men turned back. Especially some of the young men had a covetous look in their eyes, but most of them still hurried past, and no one came forward to talk. On this side, Lu Chun said to Old Ma seriously, "In a few days it will be the day to collect the tea. I also have to go collect the goods. You go back first." Old Ma cursed, "Bullshit. Do you think I'm blind?" Lu Chun smiled and said, "Then do you want to come with me to collect the goods?" Old Ma sneered and said, "Don't say that I didn't warn you. Be careful that you don't play yourself to death." With that said, he clasped his hands behind his back and strode away. Lu Chun smiled at Old Ma's back, then walked straight to the peach tree and said with a smile, "What's wrong? I remember that you were sleeping in. Why did you come out to watch the show?" Ding Dang rolled her eyes at him, then looked towards the village entrance and said, "I heard that the commotion outside wasn't right, so I wanted to come out to take a look. In the end, just as I reached here, everyone returned. What's going on outside?" Lu Chun then told her everything, causing Ding Dang to suck in a breath of cold air, her face revealing a trace of fear as she said, "Ah, wasn't that person also a disciple of the Thousand Autumns sect? He had already cultivated immortal arts. How could he die just like that?" Lu Chun laughed, using his hand to lightly pat Ding Dong's head. He laughed and said, "What are you saying? On what basis can a cultivator who has cultivated immortal arts and divine arts not die? Go, go, go." Ding Dang said coquettishly, waving her hand to hit the hand that Lu Chun used to take advantage of her a few times. Then with a look of yearning and melancholy she said, "But the cultivators that we dream of, isn't it to seek immortality, to ascend and become immortals? It's not easy for us to have this opportunity. We should just peacefully cultivate and live our lives honestly. How can there be so many messy things? Che, you've only seen so much, and you're already sighing here." Lu Chun glanced at her and said to her, "Let me tell you, we didn't see it just now, but the dead person outside the village was slashed 7 times. One sword cut off his hand, 2 swords pierced through his abdomen, 1 sword cut through his ribs, and the other 3 swords slashed his face. Blood splattered everywhere, and in the end, all that was left was a pile of meat paste, no longer recognizable as a person. Ding Dong's face instantly turned white, her hands covering her ears. No longer caring about her elegant demeanor, she sent a kick towards Lu Chun. "Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Blarg!" Seeing her clutching her chest and about to retch, Lu Chun laughed out loud, then retracted his smile and said to her with a smile that was not a smile, "If you can't even handle such a small matter, what if you have the chance to enter a sect in the future? Then what?" "Hey!" Ding Dang gasped for breath for a while, struggling to free herself from the frightening fantasy, and angrily said to Lu Chun, "Nonsense! What kind of place is an immortal sect? How can it be as frightening as you say it is? Moreover, aren't you immortal yourself? Talking for so long here, be careful that in the future, when an immortal passes by and hears you, they might catch you and harshly punish you." Lu Chun shrugged and did not say anything more, only smiling. "Forget it. In a few days, the 1,000-year sect will send people down to collect spiritual tea and spiritual grains. I also have to go to the tea mountain to collect some spiritual tea to exchange for spirit stones." Ding Dong's eyes lit up and said, "How's the harvest recently? How many spirit stones can it be exchanged for?" Lu Chun looked at her and laughed. "Look at how anxious you are. How many spirit stones have you saved up? How far are you from 1,000? Ding Dang huffed. "This old lady is not going to tell you. In any case, if you have spirit stones, then come find me. Otherwise, get lost." Lu Chun laughed. "I say, nowadays there are quite a lot of people working in Qingshitang village, and most of them are men. As long as you are willing to let go, 1,000 isn't too hard. Go to hell. Do you think this old lady is such a loose person?" Ding Dang said angrily, but seeing Lu Chun nodding his head, Ding Dong's face reddened, and she could not help but kick him again. "Stinky man, why do you always make me angry? Are you afraid that I won't age fast enough?" Lu Chun jumped away and smiled. "Spirit stones are things that can't be brought along in life and can't be taken away in death. I have always spent them casually. But the people working in this village are probably like you. wanted to take a look at the 1,000-year sex immortal mirror. So even if they are envious of you, no one is willing to go to your door, right? Ding Dang stopped in her tracks and snorted. You know, and you still say it? Those shameless people, they only want to take advantage of me all day long. This old lady here has already kicked them out, but in the end, those spineless people all talk bad about me behind my back. After a pause, she could not help but feel a little curious. Hey, Stinky Man, I didn't think so before, but now that you mention it, it really does seem a little strange. Why is it that everyone else wants that opportunity, but only you seem to not care? Lu Chan smiled at Ding Dang, and Ding Dang frowned, suddenly feeling a chill in her heart for no reason. Chapter 12. But Ding Dong's uncomfortable feeling only lasted for a moment. After a while, Lu Chan laughed and waved his hand, saying, Spirit stones are common, but a beauty like you is not. Now that I have the chance to get intimate with you, I can't let go of this opportunity. Ding Dong's face reddened, and she rolled her eyes at him before turning around to leave. Lu Chan watched as she walked back to the house in the distance, then turned around and continued walking forward. When he reached the large locust tree, he saw that the old fisherman named Old Yu was still sitting under the tree, fishing. It was as if he was the only person in the entire village who didn't care about what happened outside. However, at this time, other than the old fisherman, Old Ma was also standing behind Old Yu. He was looking at the clear stream in front of them and couldn't stop looking. Lu Chan walked over and stood beside Old Ma, saying, There are no fish in this stream. Old Ma didn't seem surprised at his sudden appearance. Instead, he pointed at the cracks between the pebbles in the clear stream and said seriously, That's nonsense. Look, there are a lot of fish over there. Lu Chan helplessly looked at the small, grayish-black fish that were smaller than a finger and were swimming leisurely at this moment. He sighed and said, I'm saying that there aren't any big fish in the water that Old Yu wants to catch. Old Ma thought for a moment and said, You're right. The two of them walked side by the clear stream, feeling the spring breeze on their faces. As they walked, Old Ma suddenly said, That woman named Ding Dang, if she really gathered 1,000 spirit stones and luckily passed the test of the 1,000 Autumn Gate immortal mirror and became a cultivator of the 1,000 Autumn Gate, what do you think the first thing she would do? Lu Chan looked at the green mountains in the distance. A smile hanging on his lips, he said, Oh, diligently cultivating in order to live forever? Old Ma glanced at him and said, I think the first thing she would do after gaining cultivation is to sneak back here and kill the man she had a relationship with. Lu Chan laughed and patted Old Ma's shoulder. Old Ma, why are your thoughts so dark? She's a woman. She didn't do anything to you. Why do you hate her so much? Moreover, for those things that have not happened, who can say for sure? If I were to say, maybe after Ding Dang obtains the Tao, she will remember our old relationship and come back to help me cultivate on the mountain. What do you think? Saying that, he could not help but laugh out loud. Old Ma sneered and ignored him. He took a few more steps forward. Seeing that he had reached the fork in the road leading to the tavern, he suddenly said lightly, You know I'm right. Lu Chan's footsteps paused for a moment. He walked to the fork and turned to Old Ma and said with a smile, It's getting late. You go back to your wine shop. I'm going home to sleep. Old Ma stared at him and said, You've seen more things than me. Why do you turn a blind eye to it? Lu Chen's eyelids slightly drooped. After a moment of silence, he said, I've seen a lot, so I want to look on the bright side. This way, at least I can live comfortably. He shrugged his shoulders and said, Otherwise, even if I live, it might be a life worse than death, so it's better to let myself be happy. After speaking, Lu Chen laughed, looking cheerful and happy. He waved to Old Ma beside the spring breeze and under the green bamboo and peach blossoms, then turned and left. Old Ma looked at his back and shook his head. His face gradually revealed some emotions, but he didn't say anything in the end. After leaving Old Ma, Lu Chan walked along the Qingshui stream all the way to the foot of the mountain. He could see a lonely straw hut built at the foot of the mountain. Further away was a deep green pond, which was the source of the Qingshui stream. At this moment, Lu Chan plucked a bamboo leaf from somewhere and chewed it in his mouth. The slightly bitter but refreshing taste stimulated his tongue as he walked leisurely towards the straw hut. However, when he was about 100 feet away from the straw hut, his body suddenly trembled and he suddenly staggered, looking like he almost fell to the ground. Fortunately, there was a peach tree by the side of the road. Lu Chun grabbed the trunk of the peach tree with such force that the peach tree trembled and countless pink petals fell like a colorful and tempting spring rain. Lu Chun suddenly opened his mouth, the muscles on his face contorted, looking like he was shouting loudly, like a beast roaring after it was injured. However, for some reason, even if he opened his mouth wide, strangely, not a single sound came out from his mouth. Following that, his body started to tremble nonstop, as if at this moment his entire body was enduring unimaginable pain. Without any warning, in his pair of black eyes, 2 balls of flames suddenly ignited. Black flames. The black flames burned fiercely, just like that night. The black flames suddenly appeared, burning in Lu Chen's eyes. Following that, everywhere on his body under his clothes, strange low and deep sounds seemed to come out at the same time, like the friction of bones, like the wailing of flesh and blood, making one's hair stand on end. Lu Chan took a deep breath, clenched his teeth, and then strode towards the straw hut at the foot of the mountain. His footsteps were a little unsteady, as if each step brought him great pain. After just a few steps, one could vaguely see that on some parts of his body that were exposed, his face, neck, and hands, strange black stripes faintly appeared, looking like patterns. Like a burning flame, Lu Chun panted, running with big strides. The straw hut in front was getting closer and closer, but the strange scene on his body seemed to be triggered at any moment. Suddenly, on the skin on the back of his neck, a ball of strange black flames suddenly rushed out from under his skin and then began to burn. In just a blink of an eye, the flesh and skin around the black flames were charred. Lu Chun let out a low roar. His body trembled as if he was on the verge of collapsing. However, his courage and willpower came from an unknown source. Despite the excruciating pain of being burned by the black flames, he still forced himself to not collapse. Instead, he continued to run forward towards the grass hut. As if in that ordinary straw hut, there was a life-saving straw for him. As time passed, Lu Chen's condition worsened with each passing moment. Black flames continued to erupt from every corner of his body. One moment it was on the back of his hand, the next moment it was on his chest, his back, his head, his thighs, his calves, and almost everywhere else. When Lu Chen rushed to the door of the thatched hut, it looked as if his entire body had been devoured by the black flames. He pushed open the door of the hut and rushed in. The door was opened and then closed. He, who was in excruciating pain from being burned by the black fire, suddenly paused for a moment. Then, from somewhere above his head, an inconspicuous gray stalk of grass suddenly floated down. Chapter 13. The stalk of grass was reflected in his eyes that were occupied by the black flames. Lu Chun snorted, then quickly rushed to the only wooden bed in the house and lay down on it. The wooden bed looked very simple, but it was very flat, and there was a layer of bedding on it. It was unknown where Lu Chun pressed on the bed, but suddenly there was a muffled sound, and the entire bed flipped over, immediately sending Lu Chun under the bed. The thatched hut instantly became silent, empty, and there was no longer any sound. While he was still flipping in midair, Lu Chun, who was already in extreme pain from being burned by the black flames, couldn't help but let out a low roar. When his vision turned black, his body began to involuntarily fall down. He suddenly slapped his right hand heavily on his chest. There was no sound, no movement. That darkness seemed to not move at all. But the falling figure in the darkness, the body that was being burned by the black flames, suddenly disappeared. Disappeared into thin air, just like that. In the next moment, a gray light suddenly lit up in front of Lu Chun, and a moment later, his body heavily fell to the ground, making a muffled sound. The black fire was still mercilessly burning his flesh and blood. His body was charred and cracked inch by inch, as if he was about to be burned into a pile of ashes. But at this moment, the place where he was standing had suddenly become a mysterious place that was no more than 20 feet in size and only a few feet in height. This place was surrounded by incomparably thick wood that seemed to be connected together. The surface was overflowing with an ancient aura, mottled and visible, as if countless years had passed. At the same time, there was a misty green gas shrouding it, causing all the wood walls to look somewhat blurry, like an ancient tree hole. And in this tree hole, the ground was only about 2 zhang wide, and in the middle there was a puddle that took up half of the space. The rest was solid ground. The water in that puddle was clear with a hint of green. It was motionless, and for a moment, it was impossible to see how deep it was. It was like a piece of sparkling and translucent jade. However, there seemed to be an extremely strong and fresh aura coming from that puddle of clear water. At this moment, Lu Chan fell on the ground, not far from the puddle, burned by the black flames. He didn't even have the strength to stand up, but lying on the ground, he still struggled with all his strength, and then his body rolled, rolling twice, and with a splash, he fell into that puddle of water. Oh, it was a strange sound, suddenly coming from his ears, as if he was isolated from everything in this world, as if he was the only person left in the entire world. The faint water waves shook intensely. Countless large and small transparent bubbles floated in front of his eyes, a cool feeling from all directions close to his body, slowly suppressing the terrible burning feeling. This puddle was much deeper than he had imagined, but the size was only so. Lu Chun couldn't even straighten his body in the water. He just curled up like a frightened child, hiding in this incomparably quiet water. He let the water flow and wash his body. It was like a gentle hand, comforting his scarred soul. Even in the water, the black flames on Lu Chen's body still didn't extinguish. The black flames were still burning, but as if being suppressed by the strange vitality of this water, the black flames began to gradually wither, and then slowly retracted back into Lu Chen's skin, gradually becoming smaller and weaker, until it quietly disappeared from his body. The water waves surrounded him, and then at a speed visible to the naked eye, the terrible wounds left by the black flames on Lu Chen's body began to quickly recover. Very quickly, everything became as if nothing had happened, except for that extremely tired man. He tightly curled up his body, hiding in the water, for a long time did not show his head. In this quiet water, his lips seemed to be slightly trembling. He clenched his teeth, his face slightly twisted, his face filled with sorrow and pain, as if he wanted to cry, but also as if he was forcibly holding back, forcibly not making a sound. He slowly raised his head. Looking up from the water, in that rippling light, there was another blurry world, as if he could never see clearly, nor could he see the end. The next morning, the moon set, the sun rose, when the sunlight once again fell on this quiet little village. Just like in the past, the entire village seemed to suddenly wake up and become lively. Lu Chun yawned as he walked out of his straw hut, carefully closed the wooden door, and then walked down the mountain to the village. Old Yu once again sat under the large pagoda tree, fishing for the big fish that he seemed to never be able to find. People came and went in groups of 2s and 3s, laughing and chatting loudly. Most of the topics they talked about were the people from the Thousand Autumns sect who would be coming down to collect the spirit tea and spirit grains in a few days. There were also some bits and pieces of information about the massacre at the village entrance yesterday. After listening for a while, Lu Chun felt a little bored, and he also felt a little hungry, so he habitually walked to the small tavern. Although this time was a little later than yesterday, Old Ma clearly had no intention of opening the door for business. The tavern's door was still closed. However, to Lu Chun, this was of course not a problem. He walked over and knocked on the door twice, then laughed loudly. Old Ma, open the door for business. After a while, footsteps sounded from inside the house, and someone walked to the door and opened it with a creak, revealing Old Ma's slightly plump body. Lu Chun smiled and patted Old Ma's shoulder, saying, "I'm hungry. Cook something for me to eat." As he said this, he walked straight past old Ma, but then he heard a light cough from old Ma. Lu Chen's eyes narrowed slightly, sweeping across the small tavern, and then he saw a figure sitting at a table in front of him, this early in the morning. It was an old man who looked to be in his early 50s, with gray hair and a warm smile on his face, and even nodded when he saw Lu Chen. Old Ma closed the door behind him, inserted the door bolt, then walked to Lu Chen's side and said softly, "Inspector Lu just arrived here this morning." Lu Chen nodded, walked over and smiled at the old man, looking like they were actually very close, and he even patted the old man's shoulder, saying with a smile, "Old man Lu, don't you come here once a year? I remember that the last time you came to Qingshitang village was only half a year ago. Why do you miss me?" Ha ha! This old man with the surname, Lu, looked very amiable, and he smiled at Lu Chen, saying, "Little Lu, you really know how to joke, but this is a routine inspection under the orders of Hall Master Shui, so I came over to say hello to both of you." Chapter 14. Jokes aside, looking at old Lu's half-serious smile, Lu Chen said with a straight face, "What is it?" Inspector Lu smiled and said, "I'm not young anymore. 3 months ago, I met with an accident during an inspection and got injured in a fight. Thinking about it, I've worked in the Immortal Alliance for decades, so I thought it'd be better for me to retire at home." Lu Chen was slightly surprised and said in shock, "There's such a thing?" Inspector Lu smiled and said, "Isn't that so? In the future, the Immortal Alliance and Fiyunji's Hall Master Shui will send people to deal with the corresponding matters. I'll be returning to the Immortal Alliance in a few days. After finishing the last bit, I'll retire and return to my hometown. Little Lu, we've known each other for 10 years. Let's say our goodbyes today. I hope we'll meet again in the future." Lu Chen nodded and cupped his hands. "Thank you for taking care of me all these years, Inspector Lu. I can't thank you enough." Inspector Lu laughed and chatted with Lu Chen for a while. Then, he stood up and said goodbye. Lu Chen and old Ma sent him to the door. After he left, Lu Chen watched old Ma close the door. His fat face seemed to be solemn. Suddenly, he smiled and said, "Why do you look like you have something on your mind?" Old Ma glanced at him and said, "Aren't you worried at all?" Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "Didn't I tell you yesterday? The most important thing to do is to be open-minded. Don't take everything to heart. That way, you can live a more comfortable life. Tell me, what's the matter?" The higher-ups said that they'll deduct the number of spirit stones you get every month. Bang! A loud sound startled old Ma. Lu Chen slammed the table and stood up. His face was full of anger, and he shouted, "Damn it! Which bastard dares to mess with me?" Old Ma gave him a sidelong glance. Lu Chen glanced at him and snorted, "Why are you looking at me?" Old Ma gloated, "The bastard you scolded is perfected Lord Tianlan." Lu Chen was stunned for a moment, and then became angry. He said, "What's so great about a perfected lord? Is that old man going to break his promise and turn against me?" Old Ma coughed a couple of times and said, "The 6 perfected lords of the Immortal Alliance are all peerless figures with remarkable abilities. You've directly called out the perfected lord's name. Maybe you can sense it?" Lu Chen sneered and said, "So what if I scolded him? Tianlan, old man, you're an old man with short legs and long arms, fatter than a pig, full of evil tricks and bald head." Old Ma was dumbfounded and couldn't say a word for a long time. Lu Chen looked around and saw that the tavern was quiet. It didn't look like something would suddenly happen. He said to old Ma, "Look, either that old man Tianlan can't hear me, or he sensed that I was scolding him, but he didn't dare make a sound." Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Little Lu, it's not good for you to be like this." Lu Chen rolled his eyes and said, "He's going to deduct my spirit stones, and you're blaming me for falling out? Didn't you say that you would let me live a comfortable life?" Old Ma said sternly, "I was there that day too. I don't remember Senior Immortal saying this." Lu Chen said angrily, "Then who said that? I remember it very clearly." Old Ma pointed at Lu Chen's chest and said, "You said it yourself." Lu Chen looked at old Ma suspiciously, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it. Who can remember things from 10 years ago so clearly? Let's not talk about it for now. In any case, deducting my spirit stones won't do. Old Ma sighed and said, I just asked. In fact, you're not the only one deducted. All the shadows under Fuyunji are the same. Luchin was startled and suddenly stopped talking. His eyes flickered for a moment, then he stared at Old Ma. Old Ma felt a little uncomfortable under his gaze and looked away. After a while, Luchin's previous anger and ruckus seemed to have vanished without a trace, and he seemed abnormally calm. After a long time, he suddenly said, Damned old man, have you been forced into a difficult position? Old Ma smiled and looked a little bleak. He said, Senior Immortal had no choice. Zhengxiaming has been passed down for more than 3,000 years. It has a big business and countless talents, but it is also full of countless flies and dogs. Therefore, the spirit stones are always not enough to spend. Fuyunji doesn't produce, and we don't see its head. It only says that it will take care of the heroes who have made great contributions to the Immortal Alliance, but it doesn't explain any details. It is equivalent to spending such a huge amount of money every year with empty words. Many people in the Immortal Alliance have long been unhappy with it. Lu Chun was silent. After a while, he shook his head gently and didn't say anything. Old Ma glanced at him, walked to his side, sat down, and said in a low voice, In the end, you and I both know that Senior Immortal feels guilty towards you. If possible, he doesn't want to make you feel wronged. But if he doesn't deduct your share, it will be highlighted. At that time, if it attracts the attention of people with ulterior motives. At this point, Old Ma paused and said, Fuyunji is under the banner of Senior Immortal Tianlan in the Immortal Alliance, but there are a lot of hall masters, supervisors, inspectors, and monitors. All these years, only Senior Immortal and I know your real identity. Even Inspector Liu, who has been secretly patrolling for 10 years, and even Hall Master Shui, who is in charge of the affairs, don't know the inside story. They only think that you are the kind of people who have made some small contributions and then entered Fuyunji to eat and wait for death. Lu Chan suddenly grinned and said, Old man Liu hasn't been bad to me all these years, but he doesn't have much respect for me either. Where did you find out about my identity? Old Ma forced a smile again and shook his head with a sigh. Logically speaking, even this identity shouldn't have been revealed. But now this Immortal Alliance looks famous, but inside, it is like a sieve filled with water. So this is also what Senior Immortal is worried about. Lu Chan was silent for a while, and suddenly said lightly, Those people are still investigating. Old Ma hesitated for a while, but still nodded and said, Yes. That battle back then could be said to have hurt the foundation of the evil cult. Not to mention the destruction of the god-subduing spell. The most important thing is that 3 out of 5 elders are gone. This hatred is a blood feud that can't be solved. These few years, we have caught some evildoers of the evil cult. After interrogation, when I asked about this, they all said that the evil cult has secretly sent countless people into the Immortal Alliance and the major cultivation sections. Their first priority is to investigate that matter back then. They must dig out the culprit, then tear the body into pieces, and extract the soul to refine the spirit for revenge. Lu Chin snorted and said to Old Ma, You can just say revenge. You don't have to say the words tear the body into pieces and extract the soul to refine the spirit. Old Ma laughed and said, Wouldn't it be more imposing to add a few more words? Bah! Lu Chun spat angrily, and then said, Go cook the noodles. Old Ma said in surprise, You just said a lot of vicious killers will tear your body into pieces, and you still want to eat noodles? Lu Chun squinted at him and said, Don't talk nonsense. I have a fire in my heart. If you don't cook noodles for me, I will smash your tavern. Chapter 15. In Old Ma's heart, this tavern was obviously more important than a bowl of noodles. Hence, when Lu Chun opened the tavern door again and left, he was already rubbing his belly and burping. King Shitang village was much livelier than usual during the day. This was because the harvest day was approaching and everyone was starting to get busy. Speaking of which, Although the village's specialty spiritual tea and spiritual grains had the word spiritual in them, they were actually not spiritual materials that were of great help to cultivators in their cultivation of the immortal Tao. The real treasures of heaven and earth, which could reach the level of immortal treasures, would have special and complete spirit patterns on them. These were the roots of the 5 elements of heaven and earth gathered in them, which gave them all kinds of strange, incredible, and miraculous functions. On a spiritual material, whether it was a spiritual herb, a spiritual beast, or a spiritual elixir, the more spiritual patterns it had, the higher the grade of the spiritual material. In the cultivation world, it was commonly known as a 1-stripe spiritual material, 2-stripe spiritual material, and so on. Generally speaking, even a most ordinary 1-stripe spiritual material possessed extremely powerful effects and was extremely valuable. Moreover, the higher the grade of spiritual material, the more spiritual markings they possessed. Not only were they extremely rare, their value was immeasurable, and they had always been sought after and fought over by the cultivators in the world. As for the spiritual tea and spiritual grains produced in Qingshitang village, the reason why they could be purchased by cultivation sect like Thousand Autumns sect was because these items actually had spiritual inscriptions on them. However, the spiritual inscriptions here were incomplete and incomplete. They contained spiritual energy, but their functions were only average. In fact, there were a lot of things in the world that were above ordinary items but below the formal spiritual tattoos and spiritual materials. Some of them were useless, but some could be slightly beneficial to cultivators. Therefore, some cultivation sects would send people to buy them. Lu Chun had lived in Qingshitang village for many years and had always said that he was selling spiritual tea. In reality, he really did have 2 acres of tea field on the tea mountain behind the village. He had bought it when he first came here. Of course, Lu Chun didn't know how to plant spirit tea trees at all. The weeds in the field were overgrown, and the harvest was only so. It was just a cover for the fact that he could take spirit stones from Old Ma for free every month and wait for his death. Therefore, when Lu Chun saw the excited and hopeful people bustling around the village, he felt a little emotional in his heart. Compared to these people, the deduction of some spirit stones did not seem to be too sad. Whether this was self-deception or an excuse to make himself happier, Lu Chen's mood improved a little. He walked leisurely and unknowingly approached the entrance of the village. When he came to his senses, he had already seen the road outside the village. However, he realized that the corpse from yesterday had disappeared. There was only a dark brown dried blood stain left on the road. After a few days of people coming and going, perhaps even the blood stain would disappear. Lu Chun stared at the blood stain for a moment, then turned around and walked back to the village expressionlessly. He walked along the bluestone road and saw the old fisherman sitting under the tree fishing when he was about 10 feet away from the big locust tree. He laughed and wanted to go over to take another look. Suddenly, he heard a commotion on the other side of the stream. Lu Chun was a little surprised and turned to look at the other side of Qingshitang village. Qingshitang village flowed through Qingshitang village. There were houses on both sides of the stream, but the east bank where Lu Chun was at was more crowded. About 70% of the people in the village were there. There were also many pubs, inns, and miscellaneous shops here. On the other side of the west bank, there were probably only a few inconspicuous houses, and it was usually quiet. Today was a strange day. There was actually some commotion coming from the other side of the river. Lu Chun looked in that direction and saw that there was a group of people gathered under a cluster of green bamboo on the west bank. There were both men and women, but there were quite a number of women. Some of the women that he usually saw in the village seemed to have run over there. This made Lu Chun a little curious. He walked over to a stone bridge not far in front of him, intending to see what was going on. After getting off the stone bridge, there was a group of people not far away. Before he got close, Lu Chun could hear gasps of admiration coming from the crowd. Among them, there were many gasps of surprise from the women, as if they had seen something incredible. Lu Chun was even more curious. He hurriedly walked a few steps to the side of the crowd. He found a corner with fewer people and looked in. He was instantly stunned. The crowd had formed a semicircle. Under a cluster of green bamboo, there was a young man who looked like a scholar, standing with a smile. In front of him was a wooden board with a piece of white paper pasted on it. There was a brush in his hand, but he was drawing. The scholar's appearance was very charming. He didn't look very old, not even 20 years old. Looking at his jade-like face as he held an ink brush in his hand, he was really charming. Lu Chan could even feel the strange affection in the eyes of some of the older aunties around him. But of course, what made the crowd exclaim was not just this person's appearance and charm. This young man was drawing a woman on the paper at this moment. Although it was just black and white ink, it was actually vivid and lifelike. The woman in the painting stood under the flowers, looking at each other with a gaze full of affection. Although the affection was not spoken, it was vividly written on the paper. This painting was actually extremely good. Although Lu Chun didn't understand painting, he felt that it was amazing. Just as he was exclaiming in his heart, he was suddenly startled. He realized that the woman in the painting was actually somewhat familiar. Looking carefully, it was clearly Ding Dang. His heart moved. He immediately turned his head to look at his surroundings. Indeed, not long later, he saw Ding Dang standing there with a strange expression on her face. Her cheeks were slightly red, as if she was angry, but also seemed to be unable to contain her joy. The surrounding girls all turned to look at Ding Dang. The jealousy in their eyes could not be hidden. Not long later, the young man had already finished drawing. He then smiled and took down the painting. He smiled and showed it to the crowd, immediately causing them to cheer. Although this painting could not be considered a big deal, everyone could see that this painting was good or bad. Adding the young man's gentleness and politeness, they naturally liked it. In the crowd, Ding Dang snorted and said, "The painting is not bad, but you are not honest. Why did you have to draw me?" The young man smiled and said, "This elder sister's words are too serious." This young man was just casually drawing. I saw that elder sister is beautiful and drew it. If elder sister does not like it, you can take it away and tear it. Actually, there is no scenery or people in the world that cannot be drawn. If everyone is interested, when this young man has free time, I can also draw one for everyone. Chapter 16. The crowd immediately cheered, especially the girls who were the happiest. Ding Dang was happy at first, but then she became angry. She snorted and said angrily, "Flowery words." The young man smiled and shook his head. He walked over and handed the painting to Ding Dang. He smiled at her and turned to leave. Ding Dang looked at the young man's back as he left. She wanted to say something, but then she suddenly heard someone in the crowd say coldly, "Vixen, trying to seduce men again." The crowd immediately quietened down. Many people laughed. There were both men and women. The men laughed in a more vulgar manner, while the women laughed more acrimoniously. The sound of the women's laughter was louder than the men's. Ding Dong's mouth twitched and her face darkened. She suddenly turned around and walked away. She quickly walked over the stone bridge and crossed the east bank. It seemed like she was going home. Lu Chun stood at the back of the crowd and calmly watched this scene. He then looked at the scholar who had already walked into another small path on the west bank. He then muttered to himself in a low voice, "How annoying. Why is it that young and handsome gigolos are more popular everywhere I go?" The painter and the person being painted had both left. The surrounding crowd naturally dispersed as well. When they left, there were many discussions. Many of them talked about the scholar, praising his handsome appearance and powerful painting skills. There were also many who talked about Ding Dang. They all laughed at her shameless flirting. They then began to worry for the young scholar, hoping that he would not be harmed by the vixen again. Luchin walked back to the east bank and yawned in boredom. Then he strolled over to the large pagoda tree and glanced at the fish cage next to Old Yu. As expected, it was empty. He sat down on the other side of the big rock and asked, "Old Yu, did you catch any fish today?" "No." The old fisherman did not seem to hear the malicious intent in his words and replied honestly. Luchin laughed and said to him, "I think you will never be able to catch any fish in this stream in your lifetime." The old fisherman was silent for a moment. Then, like countless times before, he replied woodenly, "There are fish in the water." TCH. Lu Chun stared at him. After a moment, he suddenly lost interest. There really were all kinds of weird people in this world. He said, "Up to you. If you say there is, then there is. Serves you right for wasting your life here. In the end, even if you catch it, it will still be a waste." Every time they reached this point, the two of them would have nothing else to say. But one day, for some reason, old Yu suddenly turned to look at Lu Chun and said slowly, "No, that's not it. I saw that there were spirit marks on that big fish. As long as I catch it and offer it to the Immortals of the Thousand Autumns sect, I can cultivate too." A big fish with spiritual marks. Lu Chun couldn't help but laugh. Then he said, "Oh, if you really catch, this fish is worth more than 1,000 spirit stones. It's enough for you to enter Thousand Autumn sect. But you don't get eaten by." Old Yu looked at Lu Chun strangely and mumbled, "Fish don't eat people." Lu Chun smiled and leaned over to pat him on the shoulder. He did not say anything else. He glanced at the crystal clear stream and got up to leave. At this time, the sun had already risen and shone on King Shitang village. The King Shitang stream shimmered, and a large locust tree shaded the sun. It was very cool and refreshing. Only small pieces of the sun fell through the gaps in the leafy canopy. Lu Chun took 2 steps outside. Just as he was about to leave, a ray of sunlight suddenly flickered under the shade of the tree. It was as if a shadow had flashed in a certain corner of the large pagoda tree. Lu Chun's body suddenly stopped. He turned and looked in that direction, only to see that it was just one of the roots of the big locust tree. A part of the roots bulged out of the ground, gripping the soil tightly. At the same time, there was a lot of green grass growing around the trunk and roots. Lu Chun's expression was a little strange. His brows were slightly furrowed, as if he was thinking about something. He was a little confused, a little nervous, and a little disgusted. But very quickly, he calmed down and his expression returned to normal. Then he walked over to that spot and kicked his feet as if nothing had happened. He took off one of his shoes as if he was going to shake off the soil on the roots. His eyes quickly scanned the area. The shadow seemed to flicker in front of him again. This time, Lu Chun saw it clearly. It was a somewhat strange pattern. It was a little scribbled, as if it was randomly carved in an inconspicuous place between the roots. In the drawing was a circle and a few lines of different thickness. When they came together, it vaguely looked like a simple and strange tree. The wound on the bark looked like it had been cut not long ago. It could not have been more than a day old. Lu Chun's expression slowly turned cold. He got up and put his shoes back on. Then he walked back to the big rock and glanced at old Yu, who was still fishing quietly. Then he lay down. He lay behind the old fisherman and closed his eyes. The sound of the flowing stream and the faint sound of the wind blowing the leaves above his head began to reach his ears. Everything seemed to quiet down, as if life in this village had been so peaceful for many years. Then he suddenly opened his mouth and broke the silence. "Old Yu, let me ask you something." "Oh," the old fisherman said woodenly. "You have been here for the past 2 days, right?" "Yes," the old fisherman said. Lu Chun pillowed his hands behind his head and looked at the green canopy above his head, as well as the broken sun peeking through the gaps between the leaves. "Has anyone else come here?" "No," old Yu said. "You know, other than you and old Ma, no one in the village likes to talk to me." Lu Chun grunted and said lightly, "I thought there were more newcomers in the village recently. Maybe you would make some new friends." Old Yu chuckled in a low voice, just like the little gray fish in the stream beside him, bubbling and then bursting. Lu Chun turned over and sat up. Then he patted his butt and walked away without another glance at old Yu. After leaving the big locust tree, he first walked a few steps towards the straw hut at the foot of the mountain, but then he stopped and thought for a moment. Then he turned around and walked back the way he came. At this moment, a man walked towards him. When he saw Lu Chun, he cupped his hands and asked politely, "Brother, may I ask if this mountain behind you is Team Mountain?" Lu Chun glanced at him and saw that he was also a young man. He carried a long sword on his back and wore a cloak. His face looked travel-worn, as if he had come a long way. Looking at his appearance and attire, he looked like an ordinary itinerant cultivator who traveled the world in search of Tao. Chapter 17. When asked about the situation at the back of the mountain, Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes. Are you going to the Tea Mountain?" A hint of joy appeared on the young man's face as he nodded his head. Then he clasped his hands together and smiled at Lu Chen. "Excuse me for asking, but do you know of a place called the Flying Swallow Rock on the Tea Mountain?" Lu Chen was stunned for a moment and shook his head. "No. I've lived here for a long time, and I'm very familiar with this Tea Mountain. There's no place called Flying Swallow Rock." The young man was stunned too. Obviously, he didn't expect to hear such an answer. He mumbled subconsciously, "That can't be." She was talking about the Tea Mountain in Qingshatang village. Lu Chen smiled. "Maybe. Anyway, this is Qingshatang village and the Tea Mountain. I've never seen the Flying Swallow Rock before. Why don't you go up the mountain and look for it yourself?" The young man thought about it and nodded. "That's true." Lu Chen turned his body and made way for him. He pointed to the green mountain behind him and said, "Follow this stone path along the stream and you'll reach the foot of the mountain. Then, there are about a dozen mountain paths that can lead you up the mountain. You can pick any one." "More than a dozen mountain paths?" The young man seemed to be taken aback. Lu Chen smiled. "Half of the front of the mountain has been planted with spiritual tea. People come and go, so of course there are many paths." The young man finally understood and smiled. "No wonder it's called Tea Mountain. Thank you." He walked forward as he spoke. Lu Chen watched him walk past him. After taking a glance at his back, he turned around and continued walking forward. He had only taken a few steps when he suddenly heard a call from behind him. It was a young man's voice. "Big brother, wait a moment. It's only been a while, and you've changed from a brother to a big brother?" Lu Chen smiled and turned around. He did not feel annoyed. Instead, he looked curiously at the young man who was running over from the bluestone path in the distance. He smiled and asked, "What's wrong?" The young man had an apologetic look on his face. Before he could say anything, he cupped his hands and bowed to Lu Chen. Lu Chen smiled and waved his hand. "You don't have to be so polite. You've been very polite since the beginning. Could it be that you're a disciple of the Kunlun party?" The young man was taken aback. He subconsciously took a step back and said in astonishment, "How did you know?" This time, it was Lu Chen who was stunned for a moment. He then looked at the young man and said in surprise, "Could it be true?" The young man paused for a moment, seeming to be a little hesitant, but then he nodded and cupped his hands together, saying, "I am Hong Chuan, a disciple of the Kunlun party. May I know your name, and how did you know my background?" Lu Chen frowned slightly, then smiled bitterly and said, "It was just a random guess. The Kunlun party was very famous in the divine central continent. It could be considered one of the famous sects in the cultivation world. This famous cultivation sect was famous for two things. First, it had a very long history. Zhengxianming, which was made up of many cultivation sects, had a history of more than 3,000 years. During this time, countless sects rose and fell. There were only two sects that could stay in Zhengxianming and had a longer history than the Immortal Alliance. The Kunlun party was one of them. As for the second most famous thing, it was because it had a very long history. This cultivation sect had a lot of rules and regulations, and paid particular attention to etiquette and rules. Therefore, the disciples of this sect, regardless of their level of cultivation, naturally paid particular attention to etiquette. As the saying goes, 3 points of etiquette when meeting someone. When it came to the disciples of the Kunlun party, it would at least become 5 points of etiquette or 7 points of etiquette. Hong Chuan seemed to have some self-awareness of his own sex characteristics. After hearing Lu Chen's question, he also laughed heartily. Then, he naturally cupped his fists together and said, "I have yet to ask for this big brother's great name." Lu Chen waved his hand and said with a smile, "You are a disciple of a famous sect, and I am just a country bumpkin. How can I bear these 4 words? I am Lu Chen." Hong Chuan said, "Oh." He actually thanked him for asking for directions just now. Lu Chan was a little amused by him and said with a smile, "Why are you back again? Is there anything else you want to ask?" Hong Chuan nodded and said, "Indeed. Brother Lu, I just thought of something. The Flying Swallow Rock was also told to me by someone else, but that person also happened to pass by here many years ago, so the name of the place might not necessarily be the same as today. I just want to ask you, is there a place on this mountain where many red-billed scarlet swallow live?" Red-billed scarlet swallow? Lu Chan thought for a moment and said, "I have never heard of this kind of swallow, but according to what you said, I have thought of a place." Hong Chuan was overjoyed and hurriedly asked, "May I ask where that is? Can you tell me?" Lu Chan pondered for a moment, then said, "The front of Tea Mountain is flat and filled with tea gardens, but the back of the mountain is a bit steep. It's also divided into two foothills, the east and west. There's a high lake on the west foot of the mountain, while there's a rarely seen sinkhole on the east foot of the mountain. Every time dusk falls, there will be thousands of rock swallows flying out of the sinkhole in search of food." Speaking up to here, Lu Chan paused and said, "That place is probably a little similar to what you said, but the local villagers call that place Ghost Crying Cave. I have never heard of anyone talking about the Flying Swallow Rock." At this time, Hong Chuan's face was already full of joy. He nodded repeatedly and bowed deeply to Lu Chan, saying, "Thank you for your guidance, big brother Lu. I can't thank you enough." He thanked Lu Chan again after he finished speaking, then turned around and strode away. Lu Chan smiled and watched Hong Chuan stride in the direction of Tea Mountain. After pondering for a moment, he turned back and walked into the depths of the village. Not long after, he returned to the small tavern. At this moment, the doors and windows of the small tavern were already open. Obviously, it was open for business. However, Lu Chan glanced inside and found that the tavern was empty. There was not a single customer. Obviously, business was slow. He smiled and stepped in. At this moment, Old Ma was sitting behind the counter. His eyes were dull, and he seemed to be in a daze. When he heard the footsteps, he hurriedly stood up and showed a trace of joy on his face. He opened his mouth and said, "Guest, please sit. What would you like to drink?" Before he could say the word wine, he saw Lu Chan's face appear in front of him. Old Ma's face immediately sank. He snorted and said, "Sit anywhere." Lu Chan laughed and said, "You are so unreasonable. Am I not a guest? It's fine if you don't entertain me, but you won't even give me a smile?" Old Ma sneered and said, "If you are willing to pay the bill, I will smile for you all day long." Chapter 18. You're not a woman. Isn't it disgusting enough to smile at me for the whole day? Lu Chan snorted, then leaned on the counter casually, his body slightly leaning forward. Old Ma glanced at him, frowned slightly, and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" Lu Chan lowered his voice and whispered a few words. Even in the quiet tavern, his voice could not be heard clearly. Perhaps only Old Ma, who was closest to him, could hear it clearly. As Old Ma listened, his face suddenly darkened. He slowly straightened his body, and after a moment of silence, looked at Lu Chan again and said, "Are you sure?" Lu Chan said indifferently, "I've seen everything that happened in there back then." Old Ma nodded, and then asked in a low voice, "What's the level of the secret code?" Lu Chan frowned, and after a moment of silence, he said, "This is a strange place. The secret code only has one tree and two leaves. At most, it's the position of commander in the evil cult." Old Ma's expression relaxed slightly, and he pondered, "It seems that they're not looking for you? Maybe there's also a demon from the Three Realms divine cult here, and they're here to summon them?" Lu Chan snorted and said, "That's too much of a coincidence." Old Ma nodded and said, "I understand. I'll find out more about it, don't worry. But didn't the Thousand Autumns sect just kill a demon from the evil cult? Maybe the evil cult demons are here for that." Lu Chan shrugged and said, "I hope so. Anyway, you keep an eye on this matter." Old Ma said, "Don't worry." Lu Chan stood up and prepared to leave, but before he took a step, he suddenly stopped and then turned to Old Ma and said, "There's another thing. Help me check it out." Old Ma said, "What?" Lu Chan said, "There seems to be a new young scholar on the other side of the stream. His appearance is handsome, and his drawing skill is good. I have never seen him before. Find out who that man is." Old Ma replied with an "oh," and said, "Got it. It's just a small matter." The sky was dark, and the night was quiet. Another night came, and the small mountain village fell into a deep sleep again. It was especially quiet under the cover of darkness. Lu Chun was lying on the bed in his straw hut. The room was pitch black. He closed his eyes, but he couldn't sleep. When people were quiet, they would unintentionally think of some past events. Those thoughts were not completely controlled by people. So even if it was something that they did not want to recall, they would still inadvertently recall it. It wasn't a dream, but when he closed his eyes, it felt like a nightmare that was hard to wake up from. There were mournful shouts, angry screams, ice-cold sword light, and terrifying pain. Of course, most of all, there were those wildly dancing black flames. He opened his eyes in the darkness, shook his head, shook off those disgusting memories, and turned over. There was the sound of the wind outside the straw hut. It was the mountain wind blowing from the Tea Mountain, and it seemed to be a bit hurried this night. Lu Chun listened for a while, and seemed to hear some noise inside. Some small, faint noise. He turned over and got off the ground, put on his clothes, and walked out. Only then did he find that the night sky was a bit cloudy, and only a few stars were flashing in the distance, making the night look a bit gloomy. The mountain wind whistled past, bringing with it a bit of coldness. Lu Chun turned around and saw the shadows on the mountain peak twisting. It was pitch black, and there was a constant rustling sound, mixed with the wind drifting over. There was no fear or surprise on Lu Chun's face. He just stared at the mountain peak for a while, and then his gaze moved up, looking at the top of the Tea Mountain. Although those strange sounds sounded somewhat frightening and gloomy, they were actually the special sound of the leaves and branches trembling when the mountain wind blew through the countless spirit tea trees on the mountain. In the gloomy and silent night, it was like the cry of ghosts, but in reality, it had no meaning. Lu Chun was also not the slightest bit afraid. He just stared in the direction of the eastern foot of the Tea Mountain, and after a while, he said to himself, "Those swallows don't seem to be moving tonight." He had lived here for 10 years, and was indeed very familiar with this Tea Mountain, including the giant pit that the local villagers called the Ghost Wailing Cave. He had also gone up to see it. The giant pit was not small, and it looked quite spectacular from top to bottom. There were indeed hundreds and thousands of swallows living on the rock walls, but whether they were the red-billed, red-feathered swallows mentioned by Hong Chuan today, Lu Chun did not know. In Lu Chun's impression, that group of swallows should be just ordinary birds and not spiritual beasts with spiritual tattoos. Therefore, it was reasonable to say that a disciple of a famous sect like the Kunlun Party would generally not be interested in such useless things. Or perhaps there was some hidden treasure in the giant pit that attracted a disciple of a famous sect like Hong Chuan to peep at it. Thinking of this, Lu Chun's heart also moved, but then he shook his head. He had no intention of being nosy. For the sake of safety, he had explored that area before, but he did not find any so-called heaven and earth treasure. Anyway, even if there was, it was someone else's opportunity. Thinking of this, he planned to go back to sleep. However, just as he pushed open the door of the straw hut, he suddenly heard a low rumble from somewhere in the night. The sound was not soft. Although it was not sharp and ear-piercing, it traveled very far in the night. Lu Chun's body paused, and he turned around to look at the source of the sound. However, he found that the place where the sound came from was pitch black, and it was coming from the deep pool at the foot of the mountain. Lu Chun frowned slightly, and he was a little surprised. The deep pool was located at the foot of the Tea Mountain, and its depth was unpredictable. This was because from 6 feet underwater, the water temperature became abnormally cold, and ordinary people could not bear it. Therefore, no one had ever been able to dive into it. For many years, this deep pool had been quietly hiding in the depths of the mountain village. Qingshui stream originated from here, and it meandered through the village, coexisting harmoniously with this small mountain village for many years. Lu Chun thought about it, and still walked toward the pool. Not long after, He walked to the edge of the pool. He opened his eyes, and, after a moment, he suddenly let out a "huh." With the faint starlight in the sky, he saw that there was actually a person floating in the pool. It was the middle of the night, and suddenly, a person was floating on the surface of the deep pool. It was indeed a little scary. At the same time, the mountain wind was mournful, and it blew nonstop. It seemed to add a bit of eerie atmosphere to the place. However, Lu Chun seemed to be completely unaware of this gloomy atmosphere. Instead, he frowned as he stared at the human figure that was bobbing up and down in the water. After a while, he suddenly muttered, "Why does he look a little familiar?" Chapter 19. In other words, you didn't sleep in the middle of the night, and when you woke up to feel the cold wind and listen to ghosts, you saw and saved a Kunlun party disciple who was almost drowned in the pool. In the tavern, Old Ma looked at Lu Chun with an unfriendly expression and said unhappily. The morning light shone through the tavern's window and fell on Lu Chun's face. He thought for a moment and nodded. "That's about it." Old Ma spat and sneered. "Do you know your identity? Especially when you just found someone in the village engrave the devil's sex secret mark. Damn it, can't you be a little more honest?" Speaking up to here, he suddenly froze and then looked up and down at Lu Chun, a trace of suspicion on his face. "Could it be? You thought of Lord Tianlan, so of course not. Who has the time to care about that damn old man?" Lu Chun said with a smile. "It's a human life, after all." Old Ma sneered and said, "Bullshit, don't pretend in front of me. Tell me, why didn't you just let that idiot drown and be done with it?" Lu Chun coughed dryly and then said with a sigh, "Old Ma, you've been very vicious recently. Why do you want people to die so easily? I think it's a sign that your yin and yang are out of balance and your qi is not in harmony. How about this? You bring me 3 spirit stones and I'll help you talk to Miss Ding Dang and let her treat you." Old Ma flew into a rage and shouted, "Nonsense! Ding Dang only needs 2 spirit stones a night, and you actually want to cheat me." Lu Chun was shocked and stood up to look at Old Ma and said, "Damn it, how do you know so clearly?" Old Ma's chubby face turned slightly red, and then he regained his composure. After a snort, he poured himself a cup of wine and drank it. Then he said lightly, "I don't know what's going on in this village." Lu Chun looked at him suspiciously and said, "But why do I feel that there's something strange about you?" "Blame your head." Old Ma reprimanded him, and then decisively changed the topic, saying, "About that evil cult secret record. I have swept through the village once. The old people should not be a problem. Among the newcomers recently, there are about 3 or 4 people who are a little suspicious. I will keep a close eye on them." Lu Chun nodded and said, "Then keep an eye on them. Tell me if there's anything." Old Ma continued, "As for the young man on the other side of the stream you mentioned yesterday, I've looked into him. His name is Li Ji, and he's not affiliated with any sect. He's a mortal who yearns for the path of cultivation. He's probably here to try his luck and see if he can enter the 1,000-year clan and find an opportunity." Lu Chun replied with a and didn't say anything else. This kind of background was the most common. 9 out of 10 newcomers who came to King Shitang village in a year had this kind of mindset. Old Ma continued, "Li Ji indeed has a good appearance. Not long after he came to this village, he has already gained the favor of many people in the village. In addition, his painting skills are excellent, and he often paints on the West Bank. His paintings are all lifelike, and most of them add a bit of charm. So he has gained the favor of the women in the village." Lu Chun thought for a while, then smiled and said, "This village has been lifeless for a long time. No wonder those women were tempted when they saw such a flirtatious and handsome man." Old Ma snorted, looking unconcerned, then added, "Oh yes, this Li Ji is also a newcomer. I mentioned that there are 3 or 4 people who are suspicious of the evil cult, and he is one of them." Lu Chun's brows immediately furrowed, as if he thought of something, and his face instantly darkened. After leaving the tavern, Lu Chun walked along the Qingshui Creek towards his grass hut at the foot of the mountain. Along the way, he saw the clear and slow flow of the Qingshui Creek, the green bamboo and peach blossoms reflected in the water, creating a beautiful scenery. Halfway there, Lu Chun suddenly heard a clamor of laughter coming from the opposite shore. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned his head to look. Sure enough, he saw 3 or 4 women standing on the western shore, covering their mouths as they chatted and laughed. In front of them was the handsome and outstanding Li Ji, who was smiling as he put away his brush and wooden board. Suddenly, there were footsteps behind him, sounding somewhat familiar. Lu Chun slightly tilted his head to look, only to see a familiar figure walking past him, walking towards the stone bridge on the creek. Her figure was graceful, and her hair was like the clouds. It was ding-dang. The woman looked at the other side, lightly lifting her skirt as she walked over, but did not notice Lu Chun, who was standing not far away. Lu Chun looked at her back, then looked at Li Ji, who was chatting cheerfully with the women on the other side, slightly shook his head, then turned and walked into the distance. Not long after, he saw the shadow of the grass hut at the foot of the mountain. There were many residents in Qingshui village today, but there was only one grass hut built at the foot of T Mountain. As for the reason, it was actually very simple. It was because when the mountain wind blew at night, there would often be a sharp, ghostly wailing sound. It was extremely terrifying. Thus, in the past few years, Lu Chun lived alone in peace, other than being a little noisy at night. Walking to the door of the grass hut, Lu Chun first looked around, and after confirming that there was nothing strange, he then pushed the door open and walked in. In the grass hut that could not be considered too big, there was a person lying on the bed. It was the Kunlun Party disciple, Hong Chuan, whom he met yesterday. At this moment, Hong Chuan was lying on the bed with his eyes tightly shut, but his chest rose and fell rhythmically. It did not seem like he was seriously injured. It seemed like he was still in a dream. Lu Chun smiled. He had no intention of waking Hong Chuan up. He just randomly pulled a stool over and sat by the door. Then he looked outside the door at the scenery of the mountain village in the distance. He did not say a word, his eyes flashing slightly. It seemed like he was thinking about something. His patience was surprisingly good. Even if Hong Chuan did not wake up, Lu Chun still did not show any signs of anxiousness. It seemed like to him, as long as he was willing, it did not matter even if he waited for 3 days and 3 nights. However, of course, things would not be so exaggerated. It was probably not noon. After the sun had risen and shone on Qingshui village, Hong Chuan's body moved slightly, and he woke up from his dream. He seemed to open his eyes with some difficulty, and then looked around with a trace of confusion. Suddenly, his body shook, and he turned over and sat up, then looked around with a shocked expression, and very soon, he saw Lu Chun sitting by the other side of the door of the straw hut. Lu Chun looked at him and said with a smile, "You're awake?" When Hong Chuan saw Lu Chun, he was also shocked, and then said, "Brother Lu, why is it you?" As he spoke, he looked at the straw hut that he was in, and could not help but ask again, "Where am I?" Lu Chun said, "This is where I live. It is a straw hut at the foot of T Mountain. My house is simple, Brother Hong. I am sorry to let you suffer." Hong Chuan immediately shook his head, and then a strange expression appeared on his face. He said, Why am I here?" Lu Chun did not hide anything. He told everything he saw last night, as well as how he found Hong Chuan in the pool and saved him. Chapter 20. Hong Chuan's expression changed several times. In the end, he let out a long sigh and said, "I didn't expect it to be like this. Thank you, Brother Lu, for saving my life." Lu Chun grinned and waved his hand to show that it was not worth mentioning. Then he said, "By the way, Brother Hong, I remember that when you left yesterday, you were clearly going to the Wailing Ghost Cave, right? Why did you suddenly faint and fall into the pool in the middle of the night?" Hong Chuan hesitated for a moment. Then he shook his head and smiled bitterly. "This is really a long story. Actually, after I went up the mountain yesterday, I did plan to go to the cave. Who knew?" Then he did not hide it from Lu Chun, or perhaps because Lu Chun had saved his life, so he told Lu Chun everything that happened yesterday. It turned out that after Hong Chuan went up the T Mountain yesterday, because it was his first time coming to this mountain, and the front mountain was planted with spirit tea trees everywhere, densely crisscrossing. Even a mountain path on the mountain was like a maze. If people who were not familiar with the terrain walked on the mountain, it was really easy to get lost. Hong Chuan was like this. In the beginning, he just randomly picked a mountain path to walk up the mountain. Anyway, he just kept walking towards the top. Who knew that after walking halfway up the mountain, he began to feel that something was wrong. There were always several forks in front of him, and some of the mountain paths that he had chosen seemed to extend to the top of the mountain. But as he walked, the direction changed. He didn't go to the east, but to the west. As a result, Hong Chuan was a little anxious and quickly turned back to walk again. Who knew that the more busy he was, the more wrong this path became, and the sky also darkened at this time. After the sky turned dark, the Team Mountain was gloomy and dim. Even identifying the road was very difficult. Although Hong Chuan carried a torch with him to light up the mountain wind was too strong and the fire could not illuminate too far. He walked further and further, and then at a certain moment, he suddenly found that a lake on the mountain appeared in front of him. Hearing this, Lu Chen also laughed and shook his head, saying, "So, you went to the Dragon Lake by mistake." "Dragon Lake?" Hong Chuan asked curiously. Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's right. The name of the place has been passed down by the villagers since ancient times. The lake on the mountain is called the Dragon Lake, and the pool at the foot of the mountain is called the Dragon Pond. It is said that in ancient times there was a dragon living here, and that the water on the mountain and at the foot of the mountain are connected. Of course, whether it's true or not depends on whether you believe it or not." As he spoke, Lu Chen laughed. Hong Chuan also smiled. Such far-fetched names were a common sight in the divine central continent. There were at least 7,000 or 8,000 places in the world named after dragons. Dragon mountains, dragon seas, dragon lakes, dragon veins, dragon hills, dragon fields, and so on could be seen and heard everywhere, especially in remote and desolate areas. They were the most popular. Moreover, the natives of almost every place could tell you a magical and distant legend. Perhaps it was because in ancient times, the divine dragons who could ride the clouds and ride the mist had left an indelible magical impression in people's minds. However, anyone with a bit of knowledge would mostly dismiss these names with a laugh. As for the reason, it was very simple. Even if the ancient divine dragons did descend to the human world, even if all the dragons work hard to live in those legends, they could only play less than 1% of the roles in those stories. Humans were too passionate, and there were too many legends. There were not enough divine dragons. Hong Chuan was born in a famous sect with a long history like the Kunlun Party, so he naturally had this bit of experience and knowledge. He looked at Lu Chen and smiled. But then Lu Chen frowned and said, "So, you went to the Dragon Lake on Shilu Mountain. How did you end up in this pool at the foot of the mountain?" Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "That's the strange part. When I saw the lake last night, I knew I had gone the wrong way after all. I was a little depressed, but it was already late and I might not be able to find my way back. So I decided to spend the night by the lake and prepare to go to Fian Rock tomorrow." At this point, he paused and then remembered something. He smiled apologetically at Lu Chen and said, the Fian Rock I was talking about is that sinkhole. Please forgive me, Brother Lu. I'm used to saying it and can't change it." Lu Chen laughed and said, "You don't have to be so polite. I know. You can continue." Hong Chuan said, "Well, then I found a place by the lake to shelter from the wind and planned to spend night. Who knew that in the middle of the night, when I was sleepy, I suddenly heard a strange sound from the Dragon Lake. It woke me up. Then I saw the originally calm lake suddenly boil. A moment later, a strange fish suddenly jumped out of the water. The water splashed down and silver light shone in all directions. It was as if it really was the legendary carp transforming into a dragon." Even the usually calm Lu Chen was shocked at this moment. He said in surprise, "What?" Hong Chuan smiled bitterly and said, This is what I saw with my own eyes last night. I didn't think of it because I heard Brother Lu mention that the lake is called the Dragon Lake." Lu Chen was also speechless for a moment. Then he heard Hong Chuan continued, "I was also stunned at that time. Because I was too surprised, I couldn't help but stand out. As a result, I only took 2 steps forward. The strange fish in the air suddenly turned its head and looked at me. According to what Hong Chuan said, that gaze seemed to contain a very strange power. Even if he had cultivation to protect himself, he still felt dizzy. Suddenly, his vision turned black and his body fell forward. In Hong Chuan's last memory, he only remembered that he staggered and fell into the lake. A cold wave of water drowned him. As for what happened after that, he had no memory. When he woke up, he was in this hut. After listening to Hong Chuan's words, Lu Chen didn't speak for a moment. He frowned and seemed to be thinking about something. After Hong Chuan glanced at him, he asked tentatively, "Brother Lu, from what you said just now, you saved me from the lake at the foot of the mountain?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, when I came out in the middle of the night, I happened to see some movement in the lake. In the end, I found you floating on the water. Otherwise, I really wouldn't have gone to the Dragon Lake to save you." Halfway through his words, he was suddenly startled and said, Could it be that the legend is actually true? The Dragon Lake on the mountain and the Dragon Lake at the foot of the mountain are actually connected by a secret water channel? Chapter 21. Hong Chuan was also dumbfounded. After a while he said, "It seems that this is the only explanation that makes sense. Brother Lu, you have lived in this village for so long. Have you heard of the legend of the strange fish in the Dragon Lake?" Lu Chen only shook his head and said, "There really isn't. The Dragon Lake and Dragon Pond, other than the grand name, there really hasn't been any activity for so many years like stagnant water. No one has ever seen the strange fish." For some reason, he suddenly paused at the last 2 words. Hong Chuan, however, did not notice it. He only sighed, and then with some rejoicing, he said, "No matter what, I really have to thank Brother Lu this time. Otherwise, I would have died here for no reason. It's really unjust." Lu Chen laughed and said, "It's just a small effort. Brother Hong don't need to take it to heart. Right, what are your plans after this? Are you going to continue to explore the Dragon Lake?" Hong Chuan pondered for a moment, shook his head and said, "The big fish in the Dragon Lake is quite strange. With my current skills, I'm afraid I still can't subdue it. I won't go and provoke it for now. If there's a chance in the future, after I return to the mountain, I will invite a few powerful senior brothers to come over. We will naturally be able to investigate." Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's fine." Hong Chuan got off the bed, tried to walk a few steps in the house, and then moved his body. Lu Chen looked at his movements and asked, "How are your injuries?" Hong Chuan said, "Shouldn't be too serious. Just some impact that caused your blood and qi to be unstable. It seems that I'll be fine after a day of rest." Lu Chen smiled and said, "That's the best. How about this? Since you have slept here for a night, why don't you stay here for the night? Tomorrow morning, I will go up the mountain with you to that crater, finish your work, so that you won't have to struggle again if you can't find the path." Hong Chuan was overjoyed. Even his face was a little red. He said with surprise, "Brother Lu, is this true?" Aye. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Just leading the way, it's nothing. We're all outside, so we're just helping each other out." Hong Chuan bowed to the ground with a sincere look on his face. He looked at Lu Chen and said, "Brother Lu is really a kind person. I can't thank you enough." The disciples of the Kunlun party were known for being well-educated and well-mannered. Receiving Lu Chen's kindness, Hong Chuan's heart was immediately filled with gratitude. Not only did he desperately express his gratitude, he also insisted on giving something to Lu Chen to express his gratitude. Lu Chen just smiled and declined, saying that it was a small matter, but Hong Chuan was serious. Then, from him, Lu Chen found out that no one was willing to talk to this disciple before Lu Chen, especially after they arrived at Qingshiteng village. Everyone seemed to be disgusted and guarded against him, avoiding him like the plague. Almost no one was willing to talk to him. After hearing this, Lu Chen was also stunned. Then he thought about it and said, "Brother Hong, maybe they thought that you're someone who's here to snatch the opportunity. You know, many people here have worked their whole lives just for that one opportunity. Even if they don't know each other, there's always a possibility that they'll be robbed of their opportunity." Hong Chuan was dumbfounded. Just because of this? Lu Chen also smiled bitterly and said, "Other than this, I can't think of any other reason. But usually, they don't act like this." "Oh, right." His eyes suddenly lit up as he looked at Hong Chuan. "It should be because you were wearing a long sword that day and looked like a rogue cultivator. You're much stronger than us mortals. If the Thousand Autumns sect came to take a look, they would naturally choose someone with some foundation like you. That's why those people were unwilling to talk to you." Only then did Hong Chuan come to his senses. He was speechless for a moment, but in comparison, his gratitude towards Lu Chen deepened. In the end, there was another round of gratitude and gratitude. Lu Chen almost couldn't take it anymore. In the end, Hong Chuan once again brought up giving gifts to express his gratitude. Lu Chen declined again, but this time he didn't push it too hard. Who knew that at this moment, something extremely awkward would suddenly happen? Just a second ago, Hong Chuan had been so sure that Lu Chen wouldn't stand on ceremony and accept the gifts. But suddenly, he realized that other than the long sword that was tied on his back, his belongings and other belongings were all gone at that moment. In the thatched hut, the two of them stared at each other. For a long time, neither spoke, or perhaps they didn't know what to say. After a long while, Lu Chen laughed dryly and said, "Perhaps I left them in the water last night. I wonder if Brother Hong has anything valuable that's missing?" At this moment, Hong Chuan's face was red and somewhat purple. He seemed so ashamed that he almost wanted to pull out his sword and kill himself. Seeing this, Lu Chen was a little worried. But fortunately, Hong Chuan didn't seem to be so stubborn. After a while, he said with a sad face, "I don't have anything important, I'm really sorry, Brother Lu." Looking at his depressed expression, Lu Chen found it funny, but for some reason, he suddenly felt a burst of warmth in his heart. Then he shook his head slightly and said in a gentle voice, "Brother Hong, do you think I'm that kind of greedy person?" Hong Chuan was shocked and quickly raised his head. No, I definitely didn't mean that." Lu Chen smiled and said, "If that's the case, why are you so depressed? We met by chance, it's fate. Why worry about this trivial property? Come, I'll take you to the village to drink a few cups of good wine. Meeting and getting drunk is a happy thing in life." Saying this, he stood up with a smile and led Hong Chuan out of the thatched hut, walking towards the tavern where old Ma stayed in the village. Hong Chuan looked at Lu Chen from behind. For a moment, he didn't know what to say, but his eyes were shining. Although at this moment, Lu Chen looked like an ordinary person, and he was a disciple of a famous cultivation sect, the difference in status between the two was actually quite big. But at this moment, in his eyes, Lu Chen's figure seemed to be getting bigger and bigger. When passing by the stream of Qingshui, he suddenly thought in his heart, could this be the extraordinary person that Father talked about in this world? It's such a pity that such a person is buried in this countryside. And naturally, Lu Chen didn't think that at this moment, he was following behind him in a somewhat embarrassed state. Thoughts were tumbling in Hong Chuan's mind. In fact, whether it was Hong Chuan or Lu Chen himself, they had probably inadvertently forgotten a fact, and that was that an ordinary person would almost never treat a cultivator with cultivation so calmly. Because between the two, not only was there a huge difference in strength, but there was also a huge difference in status. But to Lu Chen, everything seemed to be very natural. Not only did Hong Chuan not notice, even he himself didn't notice anything strange. Hong Chuan followed behind Lu Chen and found that Lu Chen seemed to be walking casually, but when it came to some forks, he almost never hesitated. Every time, he would immediately choose one of the paths. It seemed that he was very familiar with the mountain road. After walking like this for more than 2 hours, the two of them reached the top of T Mountain. Hong Chuan looked around and found that he was at the back of T Mountain at the moment. For a moment, he also felt a little emotional. He smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Fortunately, Brother Lu is leading the way. Otherwise, I would really be in trouble." Lu Chen waved his hand and said, "Last time it was because it was late at night and dark, so you couldn't see the path clearly. If it was daytime, you might not get lost." Oh, the ghost weeping cave is over there. Let's go. The two of them continued to walk along the mountain road to the east of the mountain. When they arrived at the back of the mountain, there were not many intertwining mountain roads like in the front of the mountain. Most of the time, there was only one road. Sometimes they couldn't even find the road and had to climb for a while to pass. However, both of them were agile people. This mountain road was not difficult for them. So after walking for about half an hour, Lu Chun suddenly stopped and then pointed to a place in front of him. He said to Hong Chuan, "It's there." Hong Chuan's spirit was lifted. He hurriedly took a few steps forward and looked ahead. He saw that in the front of the mountain, there was suddenly a big hole with a radius of more than 300 feet on the flat ground. He walked forward for a while and came to the entrance of the cave full of rocks and plants. Looking down, he saw that the bottom was actually very deep. With a rough look, it was at least 100 feet high. The surrounding cliff rock walls were extremely steep. Some pine vines and small trees grew tenaciously between the rocks, adding some vitality to this sky cavern. On the opposite rock wall further away, a stream of water flowed out from somewhere on the rock wall and suddenly fell down, forming a slender waterfall in midair. It flew straight down and fell into the bottom of the sky cavern. The mountain wind blew over, as if carrying a little moist air from there. The entire sky cavern looked quite imposing, making people feel awe. They couldn't help but sigh at the mysterious and magical nature. Hong Chuan also looked very amazed. After watching for a while, he couldn't help but say to Lu Chun, "There is such a scenery here. It is really rare." Lu Chun smiled and said, "When I first came here, the feeling was similar to you." He walked a few steps forward and came to the edge of the sky cavern. He looked down and said to Hong Chuan, "You look at the rock wall over there. Are there some nests embedded between the rocks? That is the nest of some swallows that live here. But whether it is the kind of swallows that you mentioned, I don't know." Hong Chuan nodded repeatedly and said, "That is good. That is good. I see the situation over there. It should be about the same. Now I only need to wait for these swallows to fly out to look for food. Then I will catch some more, and it will be considered as completing the task that the others entrusted to me." Lu Chun said, "These swallows probably came out at dusk. I see that it is still early. Let's wait here for a while more." Hong Chuan agreed, and then looked at Lu Chun. He revealed a sincere look and said, "Lu Xiong, this time you really helped me a lot. I am very grateful." Lu Chun only smiled and waved his hand to indicate that he need not be so courteous. Both of them sat on the mountain and chatted. Unknowingly, the sun was setting in the west. It was getting late. Dusk seemed to be approaching. At the same time, a strange noise was heard from below the sky cavern. It seemed that a commotion was coming over. Hong Chuan's eyes lit up. He stood up and reached into his bosom. He took out a cloth that looked very thin but full of holes. Lu Chun glanced at it. He felt that it looked like a fisherman's net. Hong Chuan turned to Lu Chun and said, "Fortunately, I was careful and tied this treasure tightly to my body. Otherwise, even if we found this place with so many agile swallows, it would be difficult for us to catch them." Oh, Lu Chun was interested. It sounded like the strange net in Hong Chuan's hands was quite capable. He retreated to the side and observed carefully. Hong Chuan did not avoid him. He held the strange net and walked to the edge of the sky cavern. He looked down and waited silently. Chapter 23. After about half a cup of tea's time, the noise below suddenly became louder. Then, a strange chirping sound gathered together like a tide. A moment later, a black cloud suddenly flew up from the bottom of the heaven pit. Upon closer inspection, one would discover that this black cloud was actually made up of swallows that were completely black in color. Lu Chun stood to the side and looked at the swallows. After carefully identifying them for a while, he found that there was a circle of scarlet around the beak of these swallows, and on the tail feathers, there were indeed a few scarlet feathers among the black feathers. They looked brighter and more beautiful than the black feathers around them. They seemed to be the red-beaked scarlet swallows that Hong Chuan had mentioned before. At this moment, Hong Chuan, who was standing at the edge of the heaven pit, could see the appearance of these swallows even more clearly. Suddenly, a look of joy appeared on his face. Then, he muttered something and suddenly shook his hands. He spread them out, and the thin net opened up with a hoo sound. It flew into the air and flew into the group of swallows. Only a burst of shouting, and the group of swallows was suddenly in chaos. The strange net's mesh was neither too big nor too small, just enough to catch these swallows. At the same time, a strange glimmer appeared on the strange net. It actually surrounded the swallows in midair and covered all of them. Then, it flew back to Hong Chuan's hand. This trip and return was really magical. This kind of method was clearly a magic treasure of the legendary Immortals sections. Lu Chun stood at the side and looked at this scene with a trace of a smile on his face. His gaze moved to Hong Chuan, who was standing at the edge of the heaven pit, and stared deeply at him. Hong Chuan was standing at the edge of the heaven pit. Not far from his feet was a cliff, but he didn't seem afraid at all. His eyes were only looking at the strange net in midair. He stretched out his arm and caught the net that flew back to him. He looked inside and immediately beamed with joy. He turned back to Lu Chun and said with a smile, "There's no mistake. It's the red-beaked scarlet swallow." Lu Chun smiled and nodded, "As long as it's right." He then asked curiously, "Oh yes, I remember that the swallows here aren't considered spirit beasts. Why did you catch them?" Hong Chuan reached in the net and grabbed a swallow. Then, he looked directly at the tail feather. After carefully looking at it, he pulled out a red feather from the feathers. Then, he loosened his fingers and let the swallow fly. Holding the scarlet feather in his hand, he smiled at Lu Chun and said, "This is it." Although the red-billed, scarlet-feathered swallow was not a spirit beast, the scarlet feathers on its tail were quite beautiful. Especially if one was not afraid of trouble, they could weave these feathers into a shawl, which was also very beautiful. There's a senior in my sect who likes this thing, so I specifically found this place to search for Chi Yu as a token of filial piety to her. I see. Lu Chun suddenly understood. He thought to himself, no wonder Hong Chuan is so interested in these inconspicuous swallows. It turns out that it's all for the sake of flattery. It's all out of filial piety. After understanding the whole story, Lu Chun was not in a hurry. He simply found a rock on the side and sat down, watching Hong Chuan use the strange net to catch these swallows. The strange net was very strange, but it was quite useful. Every time Hong Chuan used it, he almost never missed, so he quickly caught a lot of swallows. However, in the process, Lu Chun quickly discovered that Hong Chuan's requirements for the scarlet feather were quite high. He almost didn't want the ordinary ones, the flawed ones, the ones with dim luster, or the ones with missing tail feathers. Basically, he only chose the scarlet feather that looked perfect. As a result, the speed at which he collected the scarlet feather slowed down a lot. Every time Hong Chuan checked the tail feathers, he didn't kill them, but released the swallows. He seemed to be a kind person. Lu Chun waited for a while. Seeing that Hong Chuan had collected about a dozen beautiful scarlet feathers, he couldn't help but ask, "How many feathers do you want in total?" Hong Chuan said without hesitation, "At least 100. Lu Chun replied with an "oh" and said, "Take your time then." Hong Chuan turned his head and grinned at him, then turned back to catch the swallows. Just like that, they stayed on the edge of the sinkhole, and the place where the swallows looked for food seemed to be on this mountaintop. A dark mass of swallows flew everywhere. After about half an hour, Hong Chuan finally almost completed the task. He counted the collected scarlet feathers again. There were a total of 98, so he smiled and said to Lu Chun, "One more net will be enough." Lu Chun smiled and nodded, and Hong Chuan stood at the edge of the sinkhole, ready to catch again. Who knew that at this time, perhaps because of the passage of time, the sky had already darkened, and many of those swallows had already returned to their nests. The number of swallows still flying in the sky had decreased, and they looked sparse. Hong Chuan's net seemed to be unable to catch more than a few. And at the same time, more swallows were flying into the sinkhole, chirping as they flew towards the steep rock wall. Hong Chuan looked a little anxious and waited for a moment with his eyes wide open. Suddenly he saw a small group of swallows flapping their wings and flying over. There were about a dozen of them, and they also flew into the sinkhole. Hong Chuan was shocked, and when he looked again, there were almost no swallows left in the sky. In a hurry, he hurriedly took a step forward and threw the net in his hand toward the last small group of swallows. The strange net glimmered. It was indeed a magic weapon of the Immortals, and it accurately covered those swallows, and then flew back. Hong Chuan was overjoyed and leaned forward to reach out to catch it. But at this time, he suddenly heard Lu Chen's exclamation behind him, shouting, "Watch your feet." Hong Chuan's heart jumped, and subconsciously looked down, but before he could react, his body slanted, and he lost his balance and fell down. It turned out that he was already standing not far from the edge of the cliff, and just now the last net was a little hasty, and for a moment he forgot the situation under his feet. He actually stepped on empty air and immediately slipped and fell down. This time Hong Chuan was shocked and cried out involuntarily, and at the same time his hands and feet flailed, desperately trying to grab those rocks and grass on the cliff to maintain his balance. But this sudden fall, the momentum was not small. Those rocks and grass were all broken, and he actually could not hold on, and his entire body still fell down uncontrollably. At this critical moment, suddenly a figure pounced over from above. In a flash, he suddenly stretched out his hand and grabbed Hong Chuan's hand and pulled his body. Hong Chuan's falling momentum suddenly stopped, and at this time his entire body was suspended in the air, and only his right hand was grabbed by Lu Chen, who had just pounced to the edge of the cliff. The mountain breeze blew over, and both of their faces became incomparably pale. Obviously, they were frightened. Chapter 24. Hong Chuan subconsciously looked down and saw that the bottom of the sinkhole was dark, like a bottomless abyss. If he fell in, even if he had cultivation experience, he would only end up with his body broken into pieces. At this moment, Hong Chuan felt all the hairs on his body stand on end. He raised his head to glance at Lu Chen, and his eyes were filled with pleading and panic. Compared to Hong Chuan's panic, Lu Chen seemed to be calmer. However, his expression didn't look good either. His face was even slightly distorted, probably because he used too much force. No matter who it was, using one hand to grab such a big living person, it was not an easy task. He leaned on the edge of the cliff, took a deep breath, and then whispered to Hong Chuan below, "Don't move. I will pull you up." Hong Chuan's face was pale, looked like he could not even speak properly, only nodded his head. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and let out a muffled groan. He began to exert his strength to pull Hong Chuan up. Not to mention, his strength didn't seem to be weak. He actually managed to slowly pull Hong Chuan up a little. As his body slowly rose, Hong Chuan's face revealed a trace of joy, seeing that the edge of the cliff was getting closer and closer. A protruding rock was in front of him. Hong Chuan instinctively stretched out his hand to grab that rock. But at this moment, suddenly a gust of fierce mountain wind blew over. Hong Chuan's body suddenly swayed uncontrollably. Lu Chen's arm swayed a little, only felt that it was extremely strenuous for a while. He immediately panicked, growled from above, "Don't move." Hong Chuan was startled, shouted, "I didn't move, I didn't." Before he finished his words, suddenly a crashing sound was heard. The rock that he was grabbing crumbled again, falling down. Hong Chuan's body suddenly sank, and he immediately fell down. He even pulled Lu Chen with him as he fell down as well. Lu Chen was shocked just when he wanted to grab the rocks and trees beside him to stabilize his body. The falling force was too strong. He was also brought down, falling down the cliff. A strange crashing sound was heard. Gravel fell from the cliff everywhere. The two of them fell from the edge of the cliff. Fortunately, after the delay, they were still beside the cliff. At this critical moment, both of them desperately grabbed at the cliff, pine and cypress grass roots, protruding rocks, whatever they could grab, but they still kept sliding down, and the speed was getting faster and faster. Right? Almost in despair, Hong Chuan suddenly heard Lu Chen shout beside him. He looked down to the right, while falling, saw that on the cliff, about 5 or 6 zhongs below, there was a dark cave. Hong Chuan was not stupid. He immediately reacted. At this moment, the cave seemed to be their only chance of survival. He immediately screamed and used both his hands and feet to grab the hard cliff. His palms felt a sharp pain. He didn't know how many wounds he had made, but he didn't care about that. But because of this, his falling speed slowed. Seeing that the cave was in front of him, Hong Chuan let out a low roar. Using all his strength to throw himself at the cave, there were a few trees growing near the cave. His body suddenly smashed heavily on the tree trunk, only to hear a bang sound. A tree trunk near the mouth of the cave snapped in the middle. But Hong Chuan's body suddenly shook, bounced up from the air, and fell at the cave entrance. At this critical moment, Hong Chuan's body hadn't even stabilized when he heard the whistling sound of wind. A figure also fell from his side. Hong Chuan yelled and pounced over, grabbing the falling Lu Chun with both hands. With all his might, he roared angrily, turned around, and threw his body into the cave. Woo-woo sound was ear-piercing, followed by another muffled sound. Lu Chun's body heavily fell on the stone wall of the cave entrance. Accompanied by a muffled sound, he rolled on the ground twice. And Hong Chuan's body violently rotated twice. Looked like he was about to fall out of the cave entrance. At that moment, under his feet was only an inch away from the cliff. Hong Chuan's face was scared white. Fortunately, the trees at the entrance of the cave that did not seem to be very thick once again saved his life. In a panic, Hong Chuan waved his arms and grabbed onto one of the tree trunks. Only a rustling sound could be heard, and countless leaves fell. However, his body trembled and swayed countless times before he finally stabilized himself at the entrance of the cave. For a long time, the cave under the cliff was silent. Only two people who were still in a state of shock, leaning against the stone wall of the cave entrance, panting heavily. When the two people's panting gradually calmed down, they raised their heads at the cave entrance and looked at each other. The expression on their faces looked a little strange. After a moment, Hong Chuan let out a dry laugh, stood up, and deeply bowed to Lu Chun, said, "Brother Lu, I am really sorry. I have implicated you again." Lu Chun also shook his head with a bitter smile, then immediately waved his hand and said, "Forget it. Just now you also risked your life to save me once. Let's consider it a draw." Hong Chuan's face was full of regret, looking a little embarrassed, as if for a moment he did not know what to say. Lu Chun, on the other hand, seemed to be more open-minded than him. After resting in place for a while, his expression returned to normal. He looked around the cave entrance and suddenly exclaimed, These two trees seem to be gold Siamese? Hong Chuan, who was looking awkwardly at the side, was startled when he heard this and seemed to be surprised. The gold thread phoebe was not an ordinary tree species. There were spiritual patterns on the tree body. It was an authentic spiritual tree. Its leaves, buds, and roots were all useful spiritual materials in the Taoist sects. But the most precious thing was the trunk of this tree. It was tough and hard. It was of great use. Hong Chuan took 2 steps forward and came to the cave entrance with the 2 trees growing. At this moment, although the sky was a little dark, there was still some light at the cave entrance. He carefully looked at the 2 trees, including the one he had smashed before, then nodded to Lu Chun and said, "Brother Lu has a good eye. These 3 are really gold thread phoebe, but it is a pity that they do not seem to be old. The trunk is a little thin. It cannot be used as a big material." Lu Chun walked over and patted the trunk of one of the gold thread phoebe trees and said with a smile, "This is already not bad, okay? Although it is only as thick as the mouth of a bowl, this place is not a blessed enclave or a place full of spiritual power like the Spirited Mountain. Just to grow like this, it would take at least 100 years." "That's true." Hong Chuan sighed, then pondered for a moment and said, "Brother Lu, it is useless for me to take back such a gold thread phoebe. It is better for you to handle it." And at this moment, in this sky cavern in the wilderness, in terms of luck alone, the good or bad of Lu Chun and Hong Chuan did not seem to be very clear. They walked for a long distance. They felt that they had walked in this strange and natural mountain path for a long time, but they actually did not reach the end. During this process, they were quite lucky that they didn't encounter any accidents. But similarly, there weren't any Immortals abodes, peerless Tao techniques, divine ability manuals, or powerful fortuitous encounters that suddenly fell from the sky in front of them. From this point, it seemed that these two people were neither good nor bad. "I think I'm a good guy," Hong Chuan, who was walking at the back, said with some difficulty and panting. After walking in this dark and narrow mountain path for a long time, he still felt a little tired. Moreover, the surrounding was too dark and too quiet, which always made people feel a little strange. Therefore, he wanted to talk to Lu Chun. "You see, after walking for so long, nothing happened to us, so it must be okay." The torch in Lu Chun's hand was almost burned out. He looked at the last bit of burning flame with some worry and said at the same time, "Is that so? You can't decide who is good or bad by yourself. When you were in the Kunlun party, what did your fellow disciples think of you? Were you good or bad?" Hong Chuan thought for a while and said with some uncertainty, It seems that no one really said that before, no matter good or bad. Who would say others are good or bad for no reason?" Lu Chun smiled and said, "Is there not even one person who said it?" Hong Chuan shook his head and said no. Lu Chun said, "Then in your heart, have you ever thought about who is good and who is bad?" Hong Chuan was startled and said, "I think it should be us righteous people who cultivate the celestial way and uphold justice, are good people. Those evil people who kill innocent people indiscriminately are bad people." Lu Chen's body paused for a while, as if he wanted to say something, but for some reason, he stopped. Hong Chuan followed behind him. Seeing him stop, he also stopped behind him and said, "Brother Lu, what's wrong?" Lu Chun turned around and looked at Hong Chuan. When he opened his mouth and seemed to want to say something, suddenly, the two people's eyes suddenly darkened. The torch had burned to the end. The last bit of flame was also extinguished. The cave in the belly of the mountain was suddenly plunged into darkness. Both of them fell silent. Darkness surged in from all directions in an instant. Silence reigned all around, not knowing when it started. In the silence that seemed to be able to hear the heartbeat, Lu Chen's calm voice suddenly sounded, "Let's continue walking." Hong Chuan was shocked because at this time, he could hardly see Lu Chen's figure in front of him, let alone continue walking. He couldn't help but ask, "It's so dark, can you see the road? If only there was a torch." Lu Chen slowly turned around, walked forward and said, "Let's go." Hong Chuan hesitated for a moment, but still slowly groped his way forward. But in that instant, he seemed to suddenly see a blurry figure in front of him in the darkness. It seemed to be Lu Chen's back. The strange thing was when he saw Lu Chun walking, that posture was still the same as before. One of his hands was still holding the torch, as if there was still light guiding him forward. But it was clearly dark all around. There was not the slightest bit of light. That blurry figure was still walking forward. His hand was still held, as if there was really a fire burning, silently burning. Even the fire seemed to be black, black flames. In the legends, whenever such a situation was encountered, there would often be a major event, or a fortuitous encounter, or an encounter with a hermit expert, or a rare treasure. In short, the critical moment to test whether a person really had great luck to become the main character of Fate had arrived. Chapter 26. Their journey was bumpy, but fortunately, they were able to walk out of the mountain safely. If it was a dead end, the two of them really wouldn't know what to do. Standing on the mountain, the cold mountain wind blew over their bodies. When they looked up at the sky, they found that the moon tonight was exceptionally bright. The two of them looked at each other and sighed in relief at the same time. Lu Chen smiled and said, "Our luck is not bad." Hong Chuan nodded repeatedly and said, Yes, I didn't expect to be able to walk out like this." Lu Chen looked around and found that this exit from the outside was just a crack in the mountain wall covered by a forest. It looked a little dark on normal days. If one didn't go in, they wouldn't know how deep it was. There were many similar stone cracks on T Mountain. Ordinary people wouldn't be able to identify them. They didn't expect that behind this crack, there was such a natural secret passage that passed through the mountain and led to the cave on the stone wall of the sky pit. Lu Chun memorized the surrounding terrain of the cave. After a moment, he smiled and said to Hong Chuan, "No matter what, we are finally out of danger. Let's go back now." Hong Chuan nodded, and then his face was a little surprised. He said, "Brother Lu, can I trouble you again? The net that I used to catch the swallows is on the ground beside the sky pit. I need to go back and get it." Lu Chun smiled and nodded. "Let's go." The two of them turned back and walked up T Mountain. When they arrived at this area, there were actually no people here. The mountain forest was dense and full of thistles and thorns. The rocks were steep and there were no roads. So the two of them walked much harder than when they came from the mountain. But fortunately, the two of them were young and strong. They used their hands and feet to climb over. About an hour later, the two of them returned to the top of the sky pit. Hong Chuan's eyes were sharp. At a glance, he saw that on the ground at the edge of the sky pit's cliff, the net was indeed thrown on the ground. At the same time, it squirmed a few times. The swallows that were just caught were still inside. Hong Chuan was overjoyed and hurriedly ran over to pick it up. Then, he and Lu Chun retreated further away from the sinkhole and inspected the swallows in the net one by one. Not long after, they found another 4 scarlet feathers in good condition. In this way, in addition to the 98 scarlet feathers he had obtained earlier, this mission had been completed, and he had even obtained 2 more feathers. Hong Chuan let out a long sigh. Lu Chun, who was beside him, smiled and patted him on the shoulder. "Congratulations." Hong Chuan turned around and said sincerely, "I'm indebted to Brother Lu for helping me so many times this time. I'm truly grateful." Lu Chun waved his hand and said with a smile, "It's nothing. Come, since it's done, let's go back." As he spoke, he led the way back. Although it was already late at night, the moonlight was bright, and the roads on the T Mountain were more or less visible. In addition, Lu Chun was very familiar with this place, so the two of them did not encounter any obstacles or dangers along the way. Just like that, they safely walked down the T Mountain and returned to Lu Chen's straw hut. Then, the two of them rested separately. In the blink of an eye, it was the second day. When the sun rose and the sunlight drove away the coldness of the night, the sound of chickens crowing and dogs barking could be heard from afar in Kingshatang village. A few wisps of smoke curled up from the chimneys. It was a peaceful and tranquil scene. Outside the straw hut at the foot of the T Mountain, Lu Chun sent Hong Chuan, who was dressed properly, out. At the same time, he asked him, "Brother Hong, you really don't need anything else? The things you brought previously have all fallen into the water and disappeared." Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "Those are just worldly possessions. It won't be a problem." As he spoke, his expression turned serious, and he looked at Lu Chun and said, "Brother Lu, you have a noble character, which I, Hong Chuan, have rarely seen in my life. My master used to teach me that it is difficult to distinguish between good and bad people in the world, but one cannot be judged by one's cultivation level. Seeing it today, I finally know that it is the truth." Lu Chun laughed and said, "Brother Hong, you are flattering me. I only helped a little, don't take it to heart." Hong Chuan shook his head and said, "Not at all. This is not a small matter to me. And even if it is a small matter, Brother Lu acted bravely for a just cause and helped out righteously. Last night, before I fell asleep, I asked myself, if I was Brother Lu, would I be able to do the same? But after thinking about it again and again, I did not dare to say the word yes with certainty. I am really ashamed." Lu Chun was startled, and the smile on his face disappeared. He looked at Hong Chuan with a rare respect and said, "Brother Hong, you are too strict with yourself." Hong Chuan smiled and looked at Lu Chun. He said, "Brother Lu, you have indeed helped me a lot this time. In addition to that accident on the mountain last night, you even saved my life. I really do not know how to repay such a great kindness." Lu Chun smiled and shook his head. Just as he was about to say something, Hong Chuan said, "Brother Lu, let me be bold and ask one more thing. You have lived in this Qingshitang village for so many years. Is it also because of the opportunity to go to the nearby thousand-year sect to check your innate talent and see if there's a chance for you to cultivate?" Lu Chun raised his eyebrows slightly, and a faint glimmer flashed across his eyes, but he quickly returned to normal. After a moment of silence, he smiled and said, "More or less." Look at the people living in this village. Who doesn't do it for this reason? Hong Chuan nodded. After a moment of silence, he took a jade pendant from the hilt of the sword behind him and passed it to Lu Chun. Lu Chun was slightly stunned. He reached out to take the jade pendant and felt a slight coolness to his hand. The jade pendant was about an inch square and had a warm luster. There were no words on it. Only a picture of a river was carved on it. "This is..." Lu Chun raised his head and asked Hong Chuan with a puzzled look on his face. Hong Chuan took a deep breath and said sternly, "Brother Lu, this jade pendant is my personal keepsake. Keep it well. Although I don't know what kind of opportunities you will encounter in the future, if you're not satisfied, you can bring this item to Kunlun Mountain to find me. I dare not say anything else, but I will definitely ask for a chance to test your innate aptitude. If you're fortunate enough to have good fortune and fated chance, you'll be able to enter my Kunlun sect as your body's root bone. If you don't have talent and fated chance, I can also guarantee that you'll be a part-time disciple in Kunlun sect. I don't dare to say what your future will be like, but you'll be better than an ordinary person." Lu Chen's body shook slightly, and his face showed some surprise. Then his eyes flashed as if he thought of something. His expression changed a few times. After a moment, he nodded heavily and said, "I didn't expect Brother Hong to be so generous and righteous. I understand. I will accept this gift." Hong Chuan laughed and cupped his hands at Lu Chun. Without saying much, he turned around and strode away. Soon, he went down the foot of the mountain and walked further and further away on the bluestone road beside the clear water stream. Soon, his figure disappeared among the clusters of green bamboos and peach blossoms. Lu Chun, who was standing in front of the hut, looked up at the sky. He saw that the sky was blue and the sky was clear. For some reason, a smile slowly appeared at the corner of his mouth. Chapter 27. A chance to enter the Kunlun party and cultivate. In the tavern, the plump old Ma sat at a table by the window. His stubby fingers caressed the jade pendant in his hand. After a while, he looked at Lu Chun with a strange expression. Lu Chun, who sat across from him, tilted his head back and drank a glass of wine. He shrugged and said, "At least that's what he said." Old Ma snorted and stared at Lu Chun. "Don't play dumb in front of me. I don't believe you can't hear the strangeness in those words." Lu Chun smiled, but didn't say anything. Old Ma ignored him and continued, saying, "Everything in this world is the same. Look at the mortals in Qingshitang village. They spend most of their lives working hard for an illusory chance. How can this kind of chance be so easily obtained?" Lu Chun said, "Maybe Hong Chuan is a disciple of a famous sect, so it's not too difficult for him to get a chance to examine one's foundation." Old Ma sneered and said, "That's the Kunlun party, one of the top sects in Zhengxianming. Although it's no longer at its peak, a starving camel is still bigger than a horse. No matter what, it's not something a useless sect like the Thousand Autumn sect can compare to. Do you believe that the leader of the Thousand Autumn sect has to personally welcome a foundation establishment disciple of the Kunlun party?" Lu Chun smiled and said, "You're looking down on the Thousand Autumn sect too much." Old Ma sneered and looked as if he was clearly looking down on that stupid sect. Then, he suddenly paused and looked at Lu Chun. "Speaking of which, what's that guy's cultivation level? If he's a foundation establishment disciple, he's an elite of the Kunlun party. It's reasonable for him to give you a chance to examine your foundation." Lu Chun frowned and said, "Hong Chuan's foundation is very solid, but his cultivation level isn't too high. He should still be in the Qi cultivation realm and hasn't broken through to the foundation establishment realm." Old Ma shook his head and said, that shouldn't be the case. Kunlun sect is such a famous sect with so many disciples. If it's just the most ordinary disciple in the Qi refining realm, no matter what, he wouldn't have such a big face. Unless there's someone behind him, well, an elder with a very high status in the sect, or he simply has a highly respected master. Luchin thought and smiled. That seems to be true. Other than this opportunity, he also said that even if I don't have any talent, he can guarantee that I'll be a servant disciple of the Kunlun party. This is definitely something that only those with connections in the Kunlun party have. Pa! Old Ma suddenly slammed the table with an indignant expression and said angrily, damn it. It's always you guys who secretly teach each other all day long. That's why talented people like me, who don't have any background, can't achieve their ambitions. Luchin coughed and reminded him, I haven't gone to the Kunlun party yet. How could I secretly teach each other? Old Ma snorted and looked at him. You're all jackals of the same tribe anyway. Luchin laughed and then raised his head to drink another glass of wine. He then smiled and said, I won't go anyway. Old Ma was stunned for a moment, and then an unnatural expression flashed across his face. He sighed and said, it's a pity that you had such a good talent back then, but it was destroyed by the vicious black flame curse. Luchin's eyes drooped slightly, and then he smiled. He stood up and walked to Old Ma's side. He patted his thick shoulder and said with a smile, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I've lived a mortal's life for 10 years. I'm used to it now. Old Ma wanted to say something, but stopped on second thought. Luchin stretched himself and took the jade pendant from Old Ma's hand and put it back into his arms. Then he walked towards the door and said with a smile, I was tired last night. I'm going back to catch up on sleep today. Old Ma didn't get up to see him off. He just silently watched the man walk out of the tavern and gradually go away alone. Looking from afar, he always felt that his back seemed a little lonely. The weather was sunny, and King Shutang village became lively. Miss Ding Dang, who usually liked to sleep in, woke up early again today. She was dressed neatly, and her face was pretty. Walking through the village, she attracted many glances. Some were envious, some were infatuated, some were greedy, and some were jealous. However, she didn't care. She had seen these kinds of looks many times. At least in this village, she wasn't afraid. Even though 1,000 spirit stones was a large amount, it was no longer an unreachable amount. As long as she was lucky in the future, she would be able to gain the favor of the elders of the Thousand Autumns sect. These stinky men in the village, those stingy wretches who wanted to strip her naked with their eyes, and those hypocritical and jealous women, they were all ants under her feet. Thinking up to here, she couldn't help but feel a little lighthearted. The corner of her mouth revealed a trace of a smile as she looked at the surrounding village with disdain. Then, in her heart, she couldn't help but think, when the time comes, you guys will all kneel on the ground and beg me. But I definitely won't purify you guys. Young Master Li on the other side of the river is not bad. He looks quite pleasing to the eye. When the time comes, I can purify him. Also, Luchin, even though he's a lecherous, vulgar, and careless person who takes advantage of others every day, his personality is actually not bad. When the time comes, I'll purify him. Ding Dong's heart was filled with happiness. Suddenly, her eyes lit up as she saw Luchin walking over from a fork in the road in front of her. She stopped in her tracks and raised her hand to wave at him. She thought to herself, stinky man, I'm in a good mood today. Hurry up and tell me a few jokes to amuse me. In the future, I'll purify you. Who knew that today? Luchin seemed to have some thoughts in his mind. His eyes were always looking forward, and his face seemed to be deep in thought as he walked past. He actually didn't notice Ding Dong's greeting and just walked past her. Ding Dang was stunned for a moment and immediately felt a burst of anger. She stared hatefully at Luchin's back and clenched her teeth. She thought to herself, this stinky man is indeed useless. When I become an immortal in the future, no matter how much you beg me or kneel in front of me, I won't purify you. She turned her head and raised her chin like a proud peacock. She didn't look at Lu Chen anymore, but just happened to see that on the other side of Qingshui Creek, there was a group of women surrounding them. In the middle of the group, there was a handsome man standing with a smile. If it wasn't young Master Li Ji, who else could it be? Ding Dong's heart jumped. She couldn't be bothered with Lu Chen anymore. She lifted her dress and hurriedly walked towards the other side of Qingshui Creek. Chapter 28. Of course, Lu Chen, who was walking on the bluestone path, didn't know that in that instant, without any warning, without doing anything, he had already been removed from the mind of a certain woman who could possibly become an immortal in the future as a possibility of grooming him. But if he knew, he would probably smile wryly. He walked calmly on the bluestone path. He walked past the large locust tree, glanced at old Yu, who was fishing, and left the bustling crowd behind him. Then he walked toward the lonely thatched hut at the foot of the mountain that was gradually deserted. He opened the door, walked in, and closed again. The inside and outside of the door seemed to be separated from the outside. An unremarkable stalk of grass floated down from the sky, slid in front of him, and slowly fell to the ground. Lu Chen looked at the stalk of grass. A trace of fatigue slowly appeared in his eyes. Then he walked over to the bed and lay down. He lay there quietly. After a while, he closed his eyes. His vision darkened, but then light shone again. He seemed to see lofty mountains, thousands of rivers, and a vast expanse in the distance, like an ocean. These illusions were what he saw when he immersed his divine sense into his body. To most mortals, this was a very strange and miraculous ability. Only cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao could possess this ability. With this divine sense that could peer into one's meridians and qi-si, one could observe the condition of one's body, including the 5 elements divine disk in one's qi-si, which most mortals yearned for. In other words, one didn't need magic treasures like the immortal mirror to see if one had the aptitude to cultivate. However, this seemed to be a paradox. This kind of divine sense could only be possessed by cultivators who had cultivated the immortal Tao, but those who hadn't cultivated before wouldn't have this kind of divine sense, and thus wouldn't be able to see one's aptitude. Thus, mortals toiled their entire lives and paid countless spirit stones just for this pitiful opportunity. It was a pair of eyes in the unseen world. They crossed the mountains and rivers, flying forward and soon arrived at the ocean. On the path of cultivation, this was the manifestation of the qi-si, the foundation of cultivation. Every cultivator had a 5 elements divine disk in their qi-si, and on it were divine pillars that occupied the positions of the 5 elements. Metal, wood, water, fire, and earth were all different, but no matter who it was, if they wanted to cultivate, they had to have at least one pillar. With the fire pillar, one could practice the fire cultivation method. With the water pillar, one could practice the water cultivation method. With more 5 elements divine pillars, the range of cultivation method could be expanded accordingly. This was the fundamental principle of the human cultivation world for thousands of years. As for the strength of one's innate talent, it depended on the luster of the 5 elements divine pillars. They were all different, so he would talk about them in the future. At this moment, Lu Chen looked out and saw the clouds moving away and the wind blowing. Suddenly, everything was gone, leaving only an object rising up from the depths of the energy sea. It was the 5 elements godly disk. However, it was different from the dazzling godly disk of ordinary people. The godly disk in his body was charred black, withered and cracked in many places, and there was not a single divine pillar on the godly disk. Between those terrifying cracks, between the collapsed remains of the divine pillars, he could still see clusters and clusters of flames silently burning, and tearing. They were like demons in hell, glaring at him with incomparable fierceness, using the most vicious curse to burn his soul, never to stop. His eyes were indifferent and expressionless. He just looked at the godly disk that was covered with cuts and bruises, and on the godly disk that symbolized the foundation of all cultivation, there was a continuous burning flame. That was a black flame that used his soul as fuel. It looked like it was entangled with him forever, and it would not stop until he died. Day after day passed. The affairs of the world were like the surface of the dragon lake, always calm and unperturbed. Everything went according to plan, and everything seemed to be peaceful. The only change was the newcomer, Li Ji. He was getting more and more liked by the girls in the village. His paintings were really beautiful, especially the court ladies. They were vivid and lifelike, so much so that people felt that they were even more beautiful than real people. Moreover, he was really very handsome, so the girls in the village flocked to him, pestering him all day, begging him to paint for them. Ding Dang was no exception. These days, she squeezed until her head was broken, and she was thick-skinned, waking up early and returning late. She was not afraid of other people laughing at her or gossiping, and she actually made Li Ji paint for her twice. Adding the first time, it was 3 paintings. 3 paintings, all of them were of her. One painting was Summer Night leaning on the window and gazing at the moon. Another was Spring Wind Peach Forest admiring flowers. And the last was Palace Dress Girl chasing fireflies. 3 paintings. Each of them were exquisite. Each of them were beauties, as if condensed into the most beautiful moments of a girl's life, each beautiful figure reflected on the paper. Ding Dang loved these paintings. She carefully framed them and hung them in her room on the same white wall. She would often stare at them in a daze, occasionally blushing and often smiling. On this day, she was once again looking at the paintings of beauties on the wall. Her eyes were slightly intoxicated. Suddenly, she heard someone knocking on the door, causing Ding Dang to wake up. She walked out and shouted, "Who is it?" before opening the door. There was a figure standing outside the door, laughing at her, revealing his white and neat teeth. Ding Dang was startled and said, "Why is it you?" Lu Chan smiled as he walked past her, walked into the courtyard, looked around, and then said with a smile, "You speak like you are treating me as an outsider. In the entire Qingshitang village, I am probably the one who comes to your house the most." Ding Dong's face slightly reddened, and she smacked him, then closed the door, walked over, and said, "Glib tongue, why can't you change?" Lu Chen laughed, stood beside her, and then reached out to her shoulder, pulling Ding Dang into his embrace, and said, "Everyone is so familiar with each other, there is no need to put on an act." Ding Dang spat out a sentence, pushed him away, and took 2 steps to the side, but she did not seem to be angry, only pouting and sighing, and said, "I don't like it anymore." Lu Chun was startled, and the smile on his face disappeared. He frowned and thought for a moment, and said with some doubt, "Did I say something wrong? Or did I offend you?" Ding Dang shook her head. Lu Chun shrugged his shoulders. Since he did not do anything wrong, then there was nothing to worry about. His smile once again returned to his face, and then he walked over and stuffed 2 things into Ding Dong's hands and said, "Let's go. Let's enter the house." You're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.